Vita Means Life. The Unofficial Complete History of the PlayStation Vita by Sandeep Rai. Chapter 1. Before Vita. In the 1980s, nobody expected Sony to become a major player in the video game industry. The video game crash in the early 1980s destroyed most US video game companies, but the industry was reinvigorated by Nintendo. By the end of the decade, they dominated the home console market with the Nintendo Entertainment System and the portable games market with the Game Boy. Sony was arguably the biggest consumer electronics brand in the world, famous for the Walkman and their range of TV sets. Sony attempted to partner with Nintendo to release a CD-based system compatible with Super Nintendo games. But Nintendo snubbed and embarrassed Sony publicly by partnering instead with Philips. This was the start of Sony's drive to challenge Nintendo's domination in the video game market with the release of the PlayStation in 1994. The Game Boy and Game Boy Advance were two of the most successful video game machines ever released, selling 119 million units and 81 units respectively. But Sony's announcement of the PlayStation Portable (PSP) in 2003 sent a shockwave in the industry. The PlayStation had significantly outsold the Nintendo 64 N64 with its reputation for being a device for mature gamers. Nintendo was already seen as more difficult for third-party developers and publishers to work with, so Sony's friendly approach to working with developers led to more third-party games on their system. Where the N64 cartridge-based system was restrictive in terms of capacity and ability, the PlayStation allowed games of better graphics, sounds, and complexity to run, and with cheaper disc manufacturing costs. Continuing into the PlayStation 2 generation, Sony had already secured brand loyalty and continued to maintain good relationships with developers and publishers. That meant many big games were exclusive to the PlayStation 2, despite the console being less powerful than Nintendo's GameCube. The PSP was an extension of the design and mantra that led to the PlayStation 2's or PS2's success. More powerful than the Game Boy Advance, with mature games and with the ability to play music, watch movies, and surf the internet. Nintendo was caught off guard by the announcement. Their own seemingly knee-jerk announcement of the Nintendo DS in November 2003 could not assuage the rumors that Nintendo would no longer rule handheld gaming. In 2004, the PSP was revealed. The sleek black system with a large, colorful screen made Nintendo's plastic gray DS look even more childish. Where Nintendo showcased mini-games to justify the existence of the touchscreen on the DS, Sony showed games from popular PlayStation franchises like Metal Gear and Wipeout. Although the PSP was announced earlier, Nintendo launched the DS in Japan and North America in 2004, whereas the PSP only launched in Japan in December 2004 and 2005 in North America and Europe. Both systems sold well at launch, but despite the positive buzz surrounding the PSP, the DS exceeded the first week's sales of the PSP. It was the first indication that the Nintendo DS might not be as doomed as first expected. The PSP went on to sell over 80 million units, making it one of the best-selling video game systems of all time. The DS sold considerably more, with over 150 million units, but the sales of the PSP were enough for Sony to justify launching another handheld, the PlayStation Vita. Chapter 2. The NGP. Following months of rumors and speculation, Sony announced the successor to the PSP. The system, codenamed the Next Generation Portable (NGP), was revealed at an event in Tokyo in January 2011. It featured a 5-inch organic light-emitting display, multi-touch front screen, black touchpad, motion sensors, front and back cameras, and, most importantly from a gaming perspective, dual analog sticks. The NGP would use small game cartridges, dropping support for the PSP's Universal Media Disc format. Sony showed off its biggest franchises like Uncharted, Killzone, Wipeout, Little Big Planet and Resistance running on the device, and third parties showed off tech demos of popular games like Call of Duty and Metal Gear Solid 4. NGP games would even support trophies, a fan-favorite feature on the PlayStation 3 where players earn virtual trophies for achieving objectives in games. The reception was positive. The PSP had very few games being released towards the end of its life, so a new Sony handheld that could play first-person shooters with two analog sticks, replicating the console experience, was exciting. Media outlets praised not only the stylish and comfortable design, but also the tech inside the system. The low-power, high-performance ARM Cortex-A9 processor meant that the NGP was significantly more powerful than current smartphones and tablets, but used similar architecture, allowing ease of development. With the variety of control inputs, it seemed like Sony were appealing to both the core gaming audience and those that played touchscreen games on mobile devices. The NGP was designed to compete with both the 3DS and smartphones. There was apprehension on whether it could truly compete with mobile devices, but it seemed to be a foregone conclusion that the NGP would outperform the 3DS. The dual analog sticks were a particularly important addition. The Call of Duty series was the best-selling gaming franchise at the time, with millions of copies sold of each game released since Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. The promise of a Call of Duty game being playable on a handheld with dual analog sticks was exciting for gamers and the wider industry. This feature had been requested since the PSP had been revealed, and PSP fans were excited that Sony was finally launching a device that could deliver the console gaming experience on the go that had been promised of the PSP. Nintendo had officially announced the 3DS just 6 months earlier. The glasses-free 3D system with 2 screens also had a generally positive reception at its reveal. However, the announcement of the NGP just a month before the 3DS launch took the wind out of Nintendo sales. Suddenly, the 3DS looked more like a device for children, except parents were told that children under 6 years of age could damage their eyes by playing games in 3D. Coupled with a launch library lacking Nintendo's biggest franchises, resulted in the 3DS launch sales underperforming globally compared to its predecessor, the DS. The stage seemed to be set for Nintendo to lose its crown as the king of handheld gaming.
Love PlayStation? Then check out my Etsy store. For a range of books about PlayStation's history, my magazine RPM, the unofficial retro PlayStation magazine, and custom manuals for PS4, PS5, and PS Vita games. The link is in the description.
Chapter 3. Building the Hype. E3 2011 was Sony's big push for their new portable, and by all accounts it was a success. Sony had a lot to prove at E3 that year. Not only were they launching a new system, but the PlayStation Network had recovered only a month earlier from a hack that resulted in 23 days of network outage. Sony's press conference opened with a well-received apology from head of Sony Computer Entertainment America, Jack Tretton, as well as footage of hotly anticipated new PS3 exclusives such as Uncharted 3 and Resistance 3, as well as introducing a new 3D TV set. The news that stole the headlines in both the dedicated gaming press and the mainstream media, however, was the NGP, now officially named the PlayStation Vita. Sony revealed that the Vita would be launched in 2011 and would cost $249.99 for the Wi-Fi only model and $299.99 for the 3G Wi-Fi model, which was well below industry predictions. The Vita would be the successor to the PSP, which had sold well but had been eclipsed by the Nintendo DS. Sony didn't want to take any chances of history repeating itself, and so priced the Vita at the same price as the 3DS, aggressively challenging Nintendo's domination of the handheld market. Sony demoed games that would be available for the Vita, including Uncharted, Golden Abyss, Resistance: Burning Skies, Mod Nation Racers Road Trip, Wipeout 2048, Ruin, and many more. There was even an announcement from Ken Levine, creator of BioShock, that there would be a brand new entry in the BioShock series made for handheld. In addition, Sony showed off how PlayStation 3 games could be streamed and played on the Vita via remote play demonstrated with Killzone 3. Sony informed the audience that there were 100 games in development. The news was nothing but positive. Nintendo's 3DS also had a good showing at E3, but up to that point the games launched for the system had been unimpressive. In those first few months, the biggest games for the system were ports of previously released titles, for example Star Fox 64 and Street Fighter 4. A remake of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time was scheduled to launch just 2 weeks after E3, and Nintendo showed off Luigi's Mansion, a new Kid Icarus game, Mario Kart 7, and Super Mario 3D Land, all scheduled to launch by the end of 2011. However, these announcements couldn't put to rest rumors that the 3DS was failing. After selling 3.6 million units in the first 5 weeks of release, the drop in sales was massive, resulting in less than 1 million units being sold in the 3 months from April to June 2011. When the Vita priced the same as the 3DS, Nintendo's newest handheld was looking more and more like a flop. Prior to E3 2011, analysts predicted that the Vita would be priced over $300, potentially $400. Therefore, Sony surprised the industry with the $250 price tag. Sony's Kazuo Hirai, who would later go on to be the global CEO of the company, stated that Sony did not expect to make a profit on the Vita for the first 3 years of its life. Each unit would be sold at a loss, with game sales expected to eventually recoup the losses. Kazuhiro Miura, an analyst from SMBC Nikko Securities, estimated Sony would be losing 5,000 yen, approximately $65 per unit. Despite this, Sony were upbeat about the Vita's prospects and predictions it would outsell its predecessor, the PSP. Chapter 4: The First Cracks. If the Vita had launched just after E3 2011, its fortunes might have been radically different. Sony had a successful showing, and although the price of the memory cards was yet to be revealed, the buzz for the Vita was overwhelmingly positive. The 3DS, meanwhile, was seen as a subpar system with a 3D gimmick that no one wanted and very few worthwhile games. Nintendo recognized the 3DS was in trouble, and they did something about it. In July 2011, just over a month after the Vita's price was revealed, Nintendo dropped the price of the 3DS by around 30%, from $249 to $170, and even compensated early adopters with 20 free retro games. Only a month earlier, the Vita made the 3DS look overpriced, but now the tables had turned, the Vita started looking a lot less attractive. The price drop was seen as not only a response to the Vita, but also to compensate for the declining handheld market due to smartphones. When the DS and PSP were launched, smartphones were still years away from becoming mainstream devices. In 2011, phones could be used to surf the internet, watch movies, listen to music, play games that were far cheaper than those on the 3DS, and of course make phone calls. The market had moved on between the DS and 3DS launches, with analysts questioning whether dedicated gaming handhelds could succeed at all now that smartphone gaming had become so popular. The sales of the 3DS between February and July 2011 supported the argument that dedicated gaming handhelds were necessary. Up to that point, Nintendo was not having a good year. 3DS sales were well below expectations, the company had made a loss for the financial year, and the reveal of their new console, the Nintendo Wii U, left consumers confused and unimpressed. The 3DS price cut was welcomed by the industry and, more importantly, by consumers. Sales went from 800,000 units from April to June 2011 to 2.2 million from July to September 2011. The outlook was even more positive for the rest of the year, when Nintendo would launch its biggest brand name, Mario, with 2 new games for the system. Mario Kart 7 and Super Mario 3D Land would be released before Christmas 2011. Coupled with the cheaper price tag, the 3DS's fortune seemed to have completely changed. This change in fortunes seemed to come at the Vita's expense, as the outlook for Sony's handheld was on the decline. Despite the fact that the Vita was already priced at a loss for Sony, the 3DS price cut sparked rumors and expectations of a similar price cut from Sony. The analyst Hideki Yasuda from Ace Securities stated, "Gamers are increasingly anticipating Sony to lower prices, especially after the 3DS cut." Sony's head of worldwide studios, Shuhei Yoshida, told Eurogamer in August 2011 that Sony were happy with the Vita's price and had no plans to cut it. However, the damage was done, where once the Vita's price was seen as a positive of the system, it was now seen as too high compared to its nearest competitor, the 3DS, leaving Sony in a difficult position. The Vita was already priced at a loss, and dropping the price further was not financially feasible. But maintaining the price made the 3DS a more appealing proposition. The gaming media's outlook of the Vita was still overall positive, but more bad news was on the way. In September 2011, Sony had another strong showing at their Tokyo Game Show press conference, announcing big games coming to Vita, including remakes of franchise entries Final Fantasy X, Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3, and Zone of the Enders 1 and 2. There was also the reveal of Japan's 26 game launch lineup and confirmed support for digital PSP games. The PSP support in particular meant that there would be hundreds of games playable on the Vita at launch, which was important as Nintendo's 3DS offered backwards compatibility with their DS console. The company also revealed that Vita's battery life would last 3 to 5 hours, which was seen as disappointing, but it was at least in line with Nintendo's 3DS. However, the most shocking announcement came 2 days after the presentation. On September 15th, a Sony press release revealed the price on the Vita's memory cards in Japan. It was already known that Vita would use proprietary memory cards in an attempt to curb the piracy that had ravaged the PSP. However, the price had been a mystery up to that point. Sony confirmed memory card sizes would range from 4GB to 32GB, with the cheapest memory card costing 2,200 yen, $29, and the most expensive costing 9,500 yen, $124, around 40% of the Japanese price of the system, and not far from the price of a 3DS in the US. While the official prices for memory cards for the US and Europe hadn't been announced, the damage was done. Not only was the Vita $70 more expensive than the 3DS, but it now looks even less competitive when you factor in the memory card, which was mandatory for some games. Comparatively, the 3DS used SD cards, which were significantly cheaper. In an effort to limit piracy on the Vita, Sony damaged the reputation of the device permanently. Even years after the system launched, it was still criticized by many for the overpriced memory cards, which are cited as one of the main causes for the console's failure. In an interview with the Japanese site ImpressWatch, members of the device development team stated that Sony chose to use proprietary memory cards to ensure players wouldn't have to worry about the various read-write speed of SD cards, and also ensure security of the device. However, this did not justify the lack of storage on the Vita itself, and therefore forcing consumers to buy the overpriced memory cards. To make matters worse, it was revealed that only one PlayStation Network account could be assigned to a memory card. If players wanted to use a second PSN account on their Vita, they would need a separate memory card, and then would need to perform a device reset to set the Vita up again using their other PSN account. The PlayStation 3 allowed players to set up and swap between multiple PSN accounts with ease, which had the advantage of allowing users to buy digital games from different territories. It was yet another disappointment for potential Vita buyers. Trophies were a big selling point of the Vita to those gamers invested in the PlayStation brand. But more bad news came in December, when a manual for the Vita stated that trophies could only be earned by the first user of a physical game. This indicated that players could not earn trophies for second-hand games, effectively forcing players interested in trophies to buy all games new. This later turned out to be untrue, and trophies could be easily earned on second-hand games with a few simple steps, but it was another demonstration of Sony's poor messaging of the system in the lead-up to its launch. September 2011 was an eventful month for Nintendo also. The company announced the 3DS accessory that would be called a Circle Pad Pro in the West, which was an attachment to the console that gave it a second analog stick. Nintendo was criticized for announcing the accessory only months after the 3DS's launch. It was tantamount to the admission that the 3DS should have had a second analog stick at launch, but the reveal of the first game to be compatible with the Circle Pad Pro was the bigger piece of the news. The Monster Hunter games were incredibly popular in Japan, and up to that point they had been synonymous with Sony's PSP, with the most recent entry, Portable Third, shifting nearly 5 million copies in the region. However, Nintendo reached an agreement with Capcom and secured exclusivity on the 3DS for the next portable Monster Hunter game, Monster Hunter 3G, a remake of the Nintendo Wii's Monster Hunter 3. The game was announced to be launched in Japan in December of that year, just weeks before the Vita's release date. In just 3 months, Nintendo completely turned around the 3DS's fortunes. Between the strong lineup of upcoming games and the price drop, consumers were seeing the value of the 3DS, and sales reflected this. Chapter 5. Failure to launch. In October 2011, Sony confirmed that the Vita would launch in the US and Europe on the 22nd of February 2012, allowing them to focus on the Japanese launch on 17th of December 2011. 25 games would be available at launch for the Vita, including established console franchises Uncharted, Disgaea, Ridge Racer, etc., and brand new IPs, Little Deviants, Army Corps of Hell, etc. The launch lineup was impressive in terms of its variety of genres and number of titles, but it was also criticized for not having a killer app, that one game that was so good that it alone justified the purchase of the system. Despite this, Sony were confident that the Vita would be a success. 2 days before the Japanese launch, Andrew House, president of Sony Computer Entertainment, told reporters that pre-orders had exceeded their stock allocation. He didn't reveal numbers, but it was reported in the Japanese press that Sony had shipped 700,000 units, 500,000 of the more expensive 3G models, and 200,000 of the Wi-Fi-only model. Nintendo had shipped approximately 400,000 3DS for its launch, and had sold 371,000 units. Sony was betting on far better sales for the Vita. December 2011 was a big month for Nintendo also. Mario Kart, Monster Hunter 3G, and Super Mario 3D Land all launched that month in Japan over 3 consecutive weeks in the lead-up to the Vita's launch. All 3 games sold incredibly well, and were the second, fourth, and first best-selling games respectively in Japan for the year, despite each being released in the last month of the year. From a rocky start, the 3DS was now selling over 300,000 units a week, and upon the release of Super Mario 3D Land, it crossed 4 million units sold in Japan. Nintendo's strategy for launching its 3 biggest 3DS games to counteract the Vita's launch proved to be extremely effective. Consumers could only buy a 3DS with all 3 games for the same price as a Wi-Fi Vita with the smallest memory card. The decision to cut the 3DS price had paid off for Nintendo, and with quality games being released for the system, they used this advantage to effectively kill the Vita's momentum before it had even been released. The Vita sold 325,000 units in its first 2 days on the market, almost double the number of units of its predecessor, the PSP. However, many gaming media outlets saw the launch numbers as subpar based on the Vita selling 40,000 units less than the 3DS had sold at its launch, and also due to images of the Vita being left on store shelves, suggesting there wasn't as much demand for the product as expected. It seemed Sony's decision to oversupply the Japanese market with Vitas had backfired, as half of the units shipped remained unsold after the first few days on the market. Worse still, Sony had bet on the more expensive 3G model being the more desirable product, but this was not the case. Potentially due to the price, the cheaper Wi-Fi model was more in demand. It was reported that the majority of the shipped Wi-Fi models were sold compared to less than half of the 3G models. Consumers complained about not being able to find the Wi-Fi model in shops, and so chose not to buy a Vita at all, rather than buying the 3G model. Sony pushed the Vita's connectivity features as a selling point, but it appeared that portable gamers primarily cared more about affordability than anything else. When a new system launches, games are expected to also sell well. However, at the Vita's launch, only 4 games appeared in the Japanese media Create weekly sales charts, just 2 of which, Uncharted Golden Abyss and Hot Shots Golf World Invitational, were in the top 10. Hot Shots Golf was the highest-selling Vita game, shifting 61,000 copies. However, this paled against the sales of the 3DS's 3 big games, which all shifted over 120,000 copies. Even the 3DS itself had higher sales numbers than the Vita on the week of the Vita's launch. Nearly all new game systems are expected to have a sales drop in the weeks after launch. However, the Vita's sales fell to just 73,000 and 42,000 units in the second and third weeks respectively, and no Vita games made the top 20 sales charts in those weeks. This was perceived as a disastrous start to the system's life. Even the PSP sold more than the Vita in the weeks after its release, assisted by the fact that it was still seeing more new software releases than the Vita. All eyes were on the Western launch to determine if Sony's newest handheld could find the audience it desperately needed. Chapter 6. Go West. While the Vita may have failed to make a huge impact in Japan, Sony was still optimistic about the Western release. Uncharted Golden Abyss was the biggest game to launch on the system, and the series was far more popular in the West than in Japan. With the release of Uncharted 3 on the PlayStation 3 just months earlier, it was hoped that having a new Uncharted game on the Vita would drive sales to new gamers discovering the series on home consoles. However, Uncharted Golden Abyss was far from the only noteworthy title available day one, as more than 20 games were showcased alongside the hardware. This included new entries from existing big console franchises like FIFA, Wipeout and MotorStorm, ports of console games like BlazBlue Continuum Shift, Ninja Gaiden Sigma, and Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, as well as indie games like Tales from Space, Mutant Blobs, and Plants vs. Zombies. The launch library was heralded as very impressive, with multiple gaming media outlets praising its variety. The games covered a range of genres, from AAA games that replicated home console experiences, alongside smaller and cheaper experiences. The variety in price was also seen as a plus point for the system, as gamers on a budget would be able to buy smaller titles like Escape Plan or Super Stardust Delta. Due to the size of the launch library, the range of genres and prices, and the mix of new and familiar gaming IPs, the Vita's launch lineup was considered at the time by some critics in the industry as the best of any video game system. Leading up to the Western launch, Sony announced the prices of memory cards outside of Japan, and to the surprise of many, the prices were cheaper than expected. They were still overpriced compared to the standard SD memory cards, but they had at least been reduced compared to the prices seen in Japan. Sony had an uphill struggle to change the reputation of the Vita ahead of its Western release, and reducing the price of memory cards and announcing a robust lineup of games certainly helped in that respect. Sony also demonstrated its commitment to the Vita with an advertising campaign across TV, movie theaters, billboard, magazines, and YouTube. It even announced various bundles and special offers for the Vita, including giving away 8 GB memory cards with purchases of the Vita from select retailers, or offering Wipeout 2048 in the UK free when players added £5 credit to their 3G data plan. In the US, Super Stardust Delta and a free month of 3G internet was offered, although this turned out to be yet another poorly implemented plan, as there was an unclear restriction to the offer. Purchasers of the more expensive 3G Vita were forced to buy a month of data first and could only qualify for a 3-month and a game after 30 days. Having to wait a month to play a game on your newly bought console that you expected to be receiving on day one was not exactly seen as a consumer-friendly move. Despite the strong push from Sony, the gaming media was still not convinced that the Vita was a worthwhile investment. The Vita itself wowed critics. The sleek and stylish system was impressive and comfortable to play, but ultimately the games were the make-or-break factor. The Vita had a varied lineup of games, and the review scores ranged from bad, Little Deviants, to excellent, Lumine's Electronic Symphony. However, for the most part, the games were considered good but not essential. Cited by many gaming sites was the lack of a killer app in the launch library. Games like Uncharted and Escape Plan looked very impressive in trailers and demos, but the games didn't quite live up to their promise. Launch games tried to make use of the Vita's various control inputs, but rather than adding to the immersion of the games, they felt gimmicky and forced. For example, using the camera to find a light source and decipher clues in Uncharted Golden Abyss, or using the back touchpad to imprecisely move objects in Escape Plan. This wasn't the case for all games, but it added to the confusing proposition of the Vita. Core gamers wanted to play games without all the unnecessary touch controls, and people that enjoyed playing games on smartphones were used to the cheap or even free games that only required a touchscreen. In trying to incorporate the Vita's various control features into games, they took away from the experience of playing some of the games. There were some novel uses of the Vita's features, like using the front camera to take a picture of the player's face for online races of Wipeout 2048, or using the front touchscreen to perform attacks in Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. But these were additive features rather than revolutionary improvements. The best games at launch were those that focused primarily on the gaming experience rather than how to demonstrate the features of the Vita. Sony's big marketing slogan was "Console Experience on the Go," but this came to be seen as a negative when it came to reviewing the games. While the Vita was capable of running some impressive games for a handheld, the claim that it could play console games was not always considered as a positive. The Vita seemed to be in an impossible position with the games media. Its games were reviewed and compared to console games and were priced similarly to PS3 titles despite the Vita being a handheld, leading to sites like Digital Foundry analyzing Uncharted Golden Abyss and comparing it to the home console title Uncharted 3, despite the huge gulf in power between the two machines. At the same time, questions were raised around who would want to play a console game on the go. On the 22nd of February 2012, the Vita launched worldwide. Sony touted the queues at midnight openings as proof of a successful launch. However, sales did not reflect this. At the time, the PSP had the most successful system launch in the UK, selling 185,000 units at launch. Eurogamer.net reported that the Vita only managed to sell 61,000 units at launch, just over half of the 3DS's sales in its first 2 days on sale, and less than a third of the PSP's launch sales. Between the first week of its Japanese and worldwide launches, the Vita sold 1.1 million units. This was less than both the 3DS and PSP, which sold 1.26 million and 1.24 million respectively in their first weeks, but not significantly so. By the end of February 2012, Sony announced that they had sold 1.2 million units, which was considered to be a positive figure. The Vita may have been selling less than the PSP, but the Vita was launching in a very difficult gaming landscape. The Vita was competing with not only the 3DS, but also smartphones and iPods. Selling 1.2 million was considered a good start. The weeks and months to follow would be a true indication of whether there was a market for a powerful handheld gaming system. Chapter 7. Year 1. Over the 8 weeks following the global launch, only 4 games were released for the Vita in the West. Despite the console having one of the biggest and most varied launch libraries of any gaming system at the time, the lack of releases in the weeks that followed led to a reputation that the Vita was never able to shake, that it had no games, followed by claims that the Vita was dead just weeks after its release. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The muted post-launch lineup led to a perception of it having no games, and this led to lower sales and publishers cutting back support, which of course led to less games being released. With hindsight, it's easy to point out Sony's errors. They launched with over 20 games, but had the Vita debuted with less games and instead released a new game every week, perhaps its reputation would not have been so negative. The Vita was a learning experience, and not just for Sony. The launches of the PS4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch saw all 3 companies provide a constant trickle of new, smaller indie games to build their game libraries between the bigger AAA releases. When the PS3 had launched, there were very few games, and this was considered acceptable at the time. But the Vita was competing with smartphones, which had dozens of new games releasing daily, which were far cheaper than the Vita's titles and, in many cases, free. Players wanted and expected more than just a handful of games every 2 months. April was filled with bad news for the Vita, selling poorly, hitting new lows in sales in Japan, and even being outsold by its predecessor, the PSP, and aging Nintendo Wii. Despite this, the Vita did have some big games for owners in the 4 months after its global launch. Unit 13 was the first big release developed by Sony's internal studio, Zipper Interactive, who made a name for themselves on PlayStation's system with the SOCOM franchise. The game was featured extensively in Sony's advertising in the lead-up to the Vita's launch, and set itself apart by being one of the first portable shooters to take advantage of the Vita's dual analog sticks. The game was broken into a series of missions of varying length, making it perfect for on-the-go play. A port of the third entry in the Disgaea series came out in April, followed by Mortal Kombat in May, which was an almost perfect console port with additional features and a new game mode exclusive to the Vita. Resistance Burning Skies, the first true dual analog portable first-person shooter, released at the end of May, and Gravity Rush was released in June. Aside from Resistance, the games had positive reviews, particularly for Mortal Kombat, but the Vita was still being criticized for not having a killer app that truly justified its purchase. 1 month before E3 2012, Sony announced that the Vita had sold 1.8 million units globally up to the end of March. This was an overall positive story as the Vita had sold 1.2 million units at the end of February. 600,000 Vitas sold in 1 month was good continued progress. 1.8 million sold in 2 months even compared favorably to the 3DS that sold 2 million units in the first 3 months of 2012. However, it did not seem possible for Sony to achieve its target of 10 million Vitas sold by March 2013. Additionally, of the 600,000 sold in March, only 52,000 were sold in Japan, which had traditionally been a more handheld-focused market, which painted a bleak picture for the console domestically. E3 was a huge opportunity for Sony to show gamers that the Vita was worth owning and that games were coming. Yet despite having a strong lineup of big-name games planned for release later in 2012, Sony barely dedicated any time to the Vita. Less than 15 minutes of the 1.5-hour conference was spent on Vita-specific announcements. More time was spent on the announcement of the long-forgotten PS3 peripheral Wonderbook. The event was lacking in Vita game announcements and instead spent more time talking about features of the system and the upcoming PlayStation Mobile initiative. Among the Vita content that was shown, a debut trailer was revealed for Assassin's Creed 3: Liberation. Remote play would be patched in, allowing Vita owners to play the PS3 games God of War 1 and 2, Echo, and Shadow of the Colossus on their Vitas, and PlayStation All-Stars was being ported to Vita and would release alongside the PS3 version. One of the most important announcements was the reveal of Call of Duty Black Ops Declassified, which was a brand new entry in the massively popular first-person shooter series, exclusive to the Vita, and it would be released by the end of 2012. Despite being planned to launch in less than 6 months, no footage was shown, and Sony did not even reveal who was developing the game. It was a cause of concern to have so little information about a game launching so soon. Sony also dedicated some of the conference to talk about PlayStation Mobile, an initiative that would allow PlayStation Network users to buy games on PlayStation-certified mobile devices and on Vitas. It would be a new marketplace for games on select Android phones and tablets that would avoid the oversaturation of low-quality games on other mobile app stores. It was a promising idea that provided the promise of more games coming to Vita, hopefully to display the no games myth. The Vita announcement that drew the most cheers, however, was the reveal that PS1 classics would be playable on the Vita in the near future, and that all previous PS1 classic purchases would be transferable to the Vita. Among the games showcased were Final Fantasy VII and Tomb Raider. Although there were some welcome announcements, E3 did little to assure Vita fans that new games were coming. Some positive news was finally coming out of Japan at the end of June with the release of Persona 4 Golden, a remastered release of the PlayStation 2 classic RPG. Vita sales more than doubled for the week of its launch, and in that 1 week, Persona 4 Golden became the system's best-selling physical game, with 137,000 copies sold. Persona and Hot Shots Golf were the only 2 Vita games to sell over 100,000 physical copies in Japan by that point. However, this did not compare well to the 3DS, which had multiple million sellers already and more on the way. The week after Persona 4 Golden's release, Vita sales fell right back down as Pokémon Black and White launched. But at least the Vita had a few weeks of selling more than the PSP. August was the month of the Gamescom show in Germany, and Sony again held a press conference. The previously announced Vita Killzone title was revealed as Killzone Mercenary, as was a trailer for Call of Duty Black Ops Declassified finally showing off some gameplay. The biggest announcement was the reveal of Tearaway, a brand new game developed by Media Molecule, the creators of Little Big Planet for the PS3. It looked to be a charming and unique title that made use of all the Vita's various control inputs, such as front and rear touch. It was a well-received announcement and went some way to demonstrate Sony's commitment to the Vita by having one of its big first-party studios working on an exclusive game for the system. During an investor call in August, Sony had more bad news in terms of the Vita's performance. The Vita had sold 2.2 million up to the end of July. Only 400,000 Vitas were sold in the 3 months between the end of April and the end of June, which compared very badly to the PSP, which had sold 1 million units in the same period. This was the last time Sony would reveal the Vita's sales on their own. Going forward, they would only announce the combined sales of the Vita and PSP. Sony also revised down their forecasted sales for the Vita and PSP, from 16 million to 12 million. But interestingly, in an interview with Games Industry International, Sony Computer Entertainment of America CE Jack Tratton stated again that Sony still expected the Vita to sell 10 million units by the end of March 2013. This seemed like an incredibly optimistic goal, given that it had sold just over 2 million units 5 months after its global release, and it seemed Sony were pinning their hopes on a strong finish to 2012, with a number of big-name franchises to be released between September and December. Sony's recently promoted CEO Kaz Hirai told Reuters in August that the Vita was selling mostly in line with expectations. He compared it to the PS3's poor launch sales and how the system was now considered successful, and noted that the success should be judged 5 to 10 years after a system has launched. More disappointing news came in August with the closure of Sony's first-party studio, Sony Liverpool, the developers of the Wipeout series, including Wipeout 2048 for Vita. Sony Liverpool was not the only first-party studio that was closed after releasing a Vita game, as Zipper Interactive, developer of Unit 13, and Big Big Studios, developer of Little Deviants, were also closed shortly after completing their Vita titles. Sony as a whole seemed to be going through some financial difficulties at this point, which was taking its toll on their dedication to the struggling Vita. August ended on a positive note, with PlayStation 1 Classic support arriving on the Vita. Dozens of games were available, including Final Fantasy 5-9, Metal Gear Solid, Crash Bandicoot 1-3, Resident Evil 1-3, Wipeout, and many more. Between the games developed natively for Vita, PS1 classics, and PSP games, the Vita had a catalogue of over 400 titles. However, it still could not shake its reputation for having no games. September started off positively, with remote play enabled for 4 classic PlayStation games, allowing Vita owners to stream and play God of War 1 and 2, Eco, and Shadow of the Colossus from their PlayStation 3s. There were hopes that this would be the start of a slew of PS3 games being available to be played via remote play, but this wasn't the case. Vita owners had to wait for the PS4's arrival to truly make use of remote play. September saw the release of 2 big-name games, Little Big Planet, which became one of the highest-rated games for the system, and FIFA 13, which was one of the lowest-rated games. Little Big Planet was a brand-new entry in the Little Big Planet series that brought cute puzzle platforming to the Vita and allowed users to create levels and share them for others to play. It was praised for its graphics, music, and its use of touch controls and the functionality for users to create whole games in the palms of their hands. FIFA 13, on the other hand, was slammed in nearly all reviews. FIFA Football, or FIFA Soccer in North America, was released alongside the Vita's global launch and was received positively. FIFA 13 was essentially the same game, just with the team rosters and kit colors updated. It was a lazy, deceptive release from Electronic Arts, and reviewers punished the game with low scores, although this didn't seem to be reflected in sales. Poor messaging seemed to be synonymous with the Vita throughout its launch and first year. In an interview with Eurogamer, Ferrell Gara, managing director of Sony Computer Entertainment UK, stated that there would be no price cut on the Vita in 2012, and instead, the system would be bundled with some of the big releases to add value for new buyers. He also admitted there would be a Vita price cut in 2013. It seemed a strange admission to make in the lead-up to the Vita's first holiday season, and may have given potential buyers less of an incentive to buy the system in 2012. October started with the launch of PS Mobile, Sony's marketplace for smaller game experiences that were compatible with the Vita and PS Mobile certified devices. Nearly 20 new games were released, ranging in price from, in the US, 49 cents, or 40 pence in the UK, to $7.49 or £5.89. PS Mobile did not seem to take off as Sony would have hoped and was shut down in December 2015. The video game market was in an unusual place in 2012, with analysts predicting that the next generation of PlayStation and Xbox consoles would be the last of their kind to be released, and the future of gaming was in mobile phones. PS Mobile was one of Sony's attempts to future-proof itself from the potential death of console gaming, which turned out to be unnecessary when the PS4 launched to record sales numbers. Still, it brought more games to the Vita, which was welcomed. However, they did not support PlayStation trophies, which was seen as a major omission. Still, the handheld trucked on, and Vita's holiday lineup was impressive. Games from the big third-party publishers, including Street Fighter X, Tekken, Need for Speed Most Wanted, Assassin's Creed Liberation, FIFA 13, and Call of Duty Black Ops Declassified landed, providing a wide selection of titles to play. Sony themselves released PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, their answer to Super Smash Bros., which received negative attention due to the fact that it seemed so similar in design to Nintendo's Fighter. Street Fighter X, Tekken, PlayStation All-Stars, and Need for Speed Most Wanted were almost straight ports of the console versions. Street Fighter X Tekken had new features added and even included the ability to have online matches with PS3 players, while Need for Speed Most Wanted was an impressive port, and although it was noted that the graphics were downgraded from the console version and some traffic had been removed, it still reviewed favorably. Assassin's Creed Liberation was probably the jewel of Vita's holiday lineup and was an ambitious new entry in the long-running franchise. It featured a new protagonist in an original story and the traditional open-world gameplay that the series had become known for. However, it suffered from technical issues, including slowdowns and crashes that resulted in less than shining reviews. With other titles releasing in a more disappointing state than expected, a lot of hopes were pinned on Call of Duty to reverse Vita's fortunes. The biggest gaming franchise in the world on a handheld system that could play first-person shooters with 2 analog sticks should have had a huge impact on the Vita's fate. But it turned out to be a rushed game with poor enemy intelligence and a lack of content, meaning that it could be finished in 1 hour. Reviews were merciless, and Call of Duty Black Ops Declassified became the lowest-scoring Vita game on Metacritic for many years. The game did sell well despite the reviews, but the Vita's reputation was again damaged. November 2012 had the lowest-scoring Vita game on Metacritic and also the highest scoring. 1 week after Call of Duty Black Ops Declassified released, Persona 4 Golden was released in North America. The title had been a highly praised RPG on the PlayStation 2, and the Vita remaster gave it a chance to shine again, and gamers loved it. It seemed like the Vita had found its killer app, but given the title's niche appeal and the fact that it appeared so far from launch meant it was too late to fix the Vita's damaged reputation. Persona 4 Golden may have not had the sales success of Call of Duty Black Ops Declassified, but it found a dedicated audience on the Vita, and those buyers would go on to turn the Vita into one of the best systems for niche Japanese games. Black Friday in the US is traditionally a time for discounts on gaming systems, leading to massive sales numbers. The Vita sold 160,000 units, which Sony again claimed was a success. But with the Nintendo 3DS and its predecessor, the DS, nearly doubling this number, it was again taken as another indication of the Vita underperforming. 2012 was a year of ups and downs for Sony's newest handheld, and although the negative stories tended to outshine the positives, releases like Persona 4 Golden and the support of PS1 games staved off the feeling of regret for Vita owners. Another positive event was PlayStation Plus support that launched for the Vita in November 2012. PS Plus was a subscription service that gave subscribers a range of free games each month. To kick off the launch of PS Plus on Vita, subscribers could download and play Uncharted Golden Abyss, Gravity Rush, and the indie gem Mutant Blobs Attack. And North American PS Plus subscribers also received Wipeout 2048, Jet Set Radio, and Final Fantasy Tactics. Even if a subscriber didn't own a Vita, they could still redeem the game on their PlayStation Network account, allowing them to download it later if they did eventually buy a Vita. The launch of PS Plus may not have had a huge initial impact on Vita sales, but it was an ongoing incentive for loyal PS Plus subscribers to eventually pick one up and play all the Vita, PSP, and PS1 games they had redeemed. Sadly, by the end of 2012, it turned out that many of the negative predictions about the Vita had come true. Mobile gaming had significantly diminished the market for dedicated handheld gaming devices, and, in general, the gaming audience was not interested in console gaming on the go, although this was later disproved by the Nintendo Switch. But 2012 wasn't the end of the Vita's story. It may not have sold huge numbers, but the Vita owners had a reputation for buying games. In 2013, Sony stated that the Vita had an impressive attach rate of 10 games per system. Many assumed the Vita would be discontinued soon after release, but it defied its admittedly low expectations and continued to grow an audience of gamers that supported both the system and the developers of Vita games. The Vita was never able to sell even close to the levels of the PSP, but the Vita's first year set the trend for the system that lasted through its life. Low install base, but enough games sold on the system to make it worth developing games for it. Independent developers in particular found success on the Vita for years after its launch, despite the low install base.
Love PlayStation? Then check out my Etsy store for a range of books about PlayStation's history, my magazine RPM, the unofficial retro PlayStation magazine, and custom manuals for PS4, PS5, and PS Vita games. The link is in the description.
Chapter 8. Indie Nation. When the PS Vita was revealed in January 2011, Sony boasted that their newest handheld system was not far off from the PlayStation 3 in terms of power and capability. Tech demos of PS3 games like Metal Gear Solid 4 were even shown running on the system. This potential was sadly never fully realized, and ports like Borderlands 2 showed the PS Vita really couldn't handle modern AAA console games without significant compromises to frame rate and graphical fidelity. Instead, where the Vita truly shone was as a home for independent games. While the big AAA video game publishers were playing it safe with sequels and tried and tested genres, indie developers were experimenting with unique, creative, artistic, and memorable experiences and finding success on digital storefronts such as Steam, Xbox Live, and the mobile app stores. Sony undoubtedly noticed this trend and the potential benefits of having indie games come first to PlayStation systems, as they actively courted indie developers early in the PlayStation 3's lifecycle. The Vita benefited greatly from this approach. During 2013 and 2014, nearly half of all Vita game releases were indie games. In fact, 7 of the 10 highest-scoring games on Metacritic for the Vita in 2013 were games from independent developers, and that number rose to 9 out of 10 in 2014's releases. In an interview with Eurogamer in 2013, Adam Boyes, SCEA VP of Developer and Publisher Relations, said that Sony is talking directly to developers. It's listening to them, it's caring what they have to say, and then it's actually taking that feedback and applying it to improving things. As part of improving relationships with the indie developers and to encourage them to launch their games first in the PlayStation ecosystem, Sony made the process of publishing games far easier. Developers were able to self-publish directly onto the PlayStation Network, avoiding the need to find a third-party publisher to support them. The submission process to bring games to the Vita and PS3 and PS4 was further streamlined when Sony introduced PubFund to pay developers in advance on their games' royalties from future sales. Sony also opened up the door to more indie games to be made for PS4 and Vita when, in March 2014, they announced a partnership with Yo-Yo Games to introduce compatibility of PlayStation devices with games developed on Game Maker Studio. This developer-friendly approach was successful not only for Sony, but for a growing number of indie developers who sought to put their games on a portable platform, yet were alienated by a crowded mobile market dominated by a handful of big-name casual games. The PlayStation ecosystem was simultaneously less hostile to new, smaller properties, while maintaining a sharp focus on more traditional console-style experiences, whereas the lack of physical buttons and over-reliance on touch-based controls forced mobile games that were originally designed for console and PC to have their controls reworked, and not always for the benefit of the game. The Vita's console controller-style inputs allowed devs to make the games they wanted without compromising the way it was played. The audience for mobile games was also very different. Mobile-centric players were used to smaller experiences to play while waiting for a train or bus, and not every type of genre of game easily fit this model. Mobile players were also less willing to spend money buying a game up front, preferring instead to download free-to-play titles with attached microtransactions. By comparison, the Vita proved to be the perfect place for indie games. Owners of the consoles tended to be dedicated gamers that were willing to buy games and play them. Plus, the system was more than capable of handling the majority of the big indie releases on Steam at the time. As a result, indie developers flocked to the Vita. New games such as Guacamelee and Velocity made their debuts on the handheld, and popular existing indie titles like Fez, Limbo, and Hotline Miami were ported across. PlayStation's strategic content team, led by Shahid Ahmad, SCEE's Senior Business Development Manager, was often credited for successfully bringing a steady stream of indie content to the PlayStation Store. In an interview with Polygon in August 2013, Ahmad stated, "More developers make more money on average on Vita than they do on mobile. When people buy a Vita, they want to purchase games. I tell developers, if you're trying to build a business, then building your game and bringing it to Vita is a great investment. If you want to play the lottery, then putting a game on iOS is more like that. You're scratching that and hoping you get discovered, hoping that a lot of people talk about you. Whereas Vita, every week when there's content coming out, people buzz about it, and it spreads like wildfire because everyone's firing that console up every day to look at the content and talk about it." Sony's 2013 E3 and Gamescom press conferences were light on AAA games, but there were enough game announcements from independent developers to keep the Vita owners satisfied. While much of the news from E3 2013 was overshadowed by the upcoming launches of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, Sony announced that Doki Doki Universe, Flower, Dead Nation, and the first season of Telltale's The Walking Dead would all be released on Vita. Gamescom yielded even more game reveals for Vita, with Sony announcing Fez, Murasaki Baby, Rogue Legacy, Binding of Isaac, Volume, and Hotline Miami 2 Wrong Number as future releases. Sony's 2014 E3 and Gamescom conferences were lighter on Vita game announcements, but that year was the launch of PlayStation's annual fan-oriented event, the PlayStation Experience. 9 new Vita games were announced or demoed, including indie hit Bastion, Broken Age, The Banner Saga, later cancelled, Severed, and Super Time Force Ultra. Years later, when even the publishers of niche Japanese games stopped releasing games on the system, indie titles continued to be made for Vita. An indie developer may not have been making a fortune with their Vita release, but the ease of porting games to the system, discoverability of games, and the willingness of Vita owners to buy games meant that there was success to be found. Although Sony's unwillingness to develop games for the system is considered a big factor in the Vita's failure to sell, they nonetheless continued to support indie developers in bringing games to Vita for over 6 years after its launch. Chapter 9. TV. The PlayStation Vita TV was announced in a September 2013 Sony press conference ahead of their Tokyo Game Show presentation. It was revealed to be a non-handheld version of the PSVita that could connect to a TV to play physical and digital Vita games, PlayStation Portable and PlayStation 1 games on the PSN Store, and PS4 games via Remote Play. The small, elegant system was about the size of a pack of playing cards, with just enough room for slotting in a Vita cartridge. The initial Japanese reception was surprisingly positive, and although it was only announced at that time for Japan, many fans were clamoring for a global release. At E3 2014, Sony announced it would be coming to the West in November of that year, and would only cost $100, which was considered an extremely attractive price point. For just $100, buyers were getting a system that had a library of hundreds of games, from retro classics such as Final Fantasy VII and Metal Gear Solid, to modern indie hits such as Spelunky and Minecraft. The PlayStation Vita TV was rebranded as the PlayStation TV or PSTV for the West, which was a sensible move given the strength of the PlayStation brand and the lingering negative reputation that the Vita had with the mainstream gaming community. Reviews were generally positive, with critics identifying its mainstream potential as a cheap games machine and media streaming device. It launched ahead of Apple and Amazon's own generation of gaming-enabled set-top boxes, giving it an early-to-market advantage. However, it was an advantage that Sony failed to capitalize on. It was no secret that the Vita didn't live up to Sony's expectations, but if the PSTV had succeeded, it could have helped improve the Vita's fortunes and brought more games to the handheld. Despite the cheap price, positive reception, and large library of games, the PSTV failed to sell, and Sony ultimately discontinued the device in the West at the end of 2015, just a year after its release. There were more than a few problems with the PSTV that caused a device with such obvious potential to fail so spectacularly. One of the biggest drawbacks of the system was that it could not play all Vita games. The handheld had a front touchscreen, back touchpad, tilt controls, and front and rear cameras, and many of the games released early on in the Vita's life tried to incorporate these features in their games. For example, Uncharted Golden Abyss used the front touchscreen to have the players rub charcoal impressions of artifacts. Wipeout 2048 used the front camera to take pictures of players for online races, and Gravity Rush used the Vita's tilt controls to aim the game's heroine, Cat, at enemies. Those games were not compatible with the PSTV, which used the Sony's DualShock 3 and DualShock 4 controllers, and therefore lacked many of the additional control inputs that were present on the Vita. To make matters worse, when the PSTV was released, it wasn't clear which games were compatible and which were not. For example, Sound Shapes, which had also launched and was playable on the PlayStation 3 using a DualShock 3 controller, could not be played on the PSTV with the same controller. Sony tried to provide a list of compatible games, but had errors on their own list, leaving it up to fans to figure out which games worked and which didn't. Strangely, some PSP games did not work with the PSTV that were compatible with the Vita. These games did not use the Vita's extra controls at all, but for reasons that were never explained, they were still not compatible. The overall lack of clear direction on game compatibility likely alienated the one audience inclined to pick up the tiny console, the Sony handheld faithful, who had stood by their PS Vitas despite the unpopularity of the device with mainstream gamers, and who would seek to play their library games on a TV screen. The PSTV used the same memory cards as the Vita, which is to be expected since it was essentially the same system without the screen and controls, and instead connecting to a TV. The machine came with 1 GB of internal storage similar to the PS Vita Slim, sufficient for some save files and a few small indie games. As with the Vita, however, if owners wanted to download and play any of the Vita's big first-party titles, a memory card would be required. Sony knew memory card prices were one of the biggest complaints about the Vita. It is arguably that including an installed 4 GB or 8 GB in the system as standard may have preempted complaints from potential buyers and helped the system sell. Perhaps most puzzlingly, the PSTV also failed to fulfill its much-valued potential as a media streaming set-top box, lacking several ubiquitous streaming apps commonly found on competitor devices. Although Netflix was available on the North American PSN store, it could not be downloaded in Europe. In 2015, just 3 months after the PSTV had launched in the West, Sony announced that the YouTube app would be removed from the Vita's PlayStation Store, further eroding the device's potential for media streaming. The device was even handicapped in terms of display. The resolution output was limited to 720p rather than 1080p, which was becoming standard for media streaming on HD TVs. Even if the device had had all the popular video streaming apps, it could not have survived without advertising support. And this again is another way that Sony failed the PSTV. In Japan, the machine received full TV adverts, but outside of the PlayStation blogs, YouTube, and gaming sites, the PSTV wasn't advertised in the West. This was a disappointing decision, especially as Nintendo later demonstrated with their NES and SNES classic systems that there is a market for nostalgic gamers. The PSTV could have been marketed as the console for lapsed gamers in their 30s and 40s to reclaim those past experiences of playing PlayStation 1 games, such as Tomb Raider and Wipeout. It was cheap enough that it could have been an impulse buy for adults wanting to go back and replay those classic games on their TV. Although advertising would have cost Sony money, there was no way the system could have succeeded without spreading the message to potential buyers. Sony had demonstrated many times that they can make high-quality hardware, and the PSTV was no exception. The potential was obvious. A cheap system that could play new and classic PlayStation games and stream video content could have been a hit. Sadly, that potential was never realized. Chapter 10. Slimming Down. 2013 got off to a better start for the Vita in Sony's home country of Japan. Sales had improved compared to 2012, and it was finally selling more than its predecessor, the PlayStation Portable, on a weekly basis. This was particularly helped by a price cut in February 2013 from 24,980 yen to 19,980 yen, only 1,000 yen more than the 3DS, and the Japanese release of Soul Sacrifice in March. These two events propelled the Vita sales above 60,000 units for those 2 weeks. Sales averaged around 20,000 a week for the first half of 2013 following the price cut in Japan, which was still favorable compared to 2012's sale of around 13,000 a week. The release of Soul Sacrifice also marked the first time since launch that the Vita's sales for the week in Japan exceeded those of the 3DS. While the 3DS was at times selling 3 times as many of Sony's handheld each week, it was a marked improvement compared to the Vita's sales in the previous year. Sony subsequently announced price cuts for the Vita in August for Europe and North America, prompting some gaming media sites to wonder whether the discounts were a sign of the company trying to shift stock ahead of a system redesign. It turned out they were right. Ahead of the 2013 Tokyo Game Show, Sony announced the PS Vita 2000 model, or the PS Vita Slim as it was more commonly called. The redesigned console was 20% thinner and 15% lighter, had a micro USB charger slot, removing the need for a proprietary charging cable, and had a better battery. It was generally considered more comfortable to hold thanks to its lighter weight and larger rubber grips on the back of the system. The Vita's well-regarded D-pad or directional pad, screen resolution and screen size remained unchanged. The casing was made out of plastic, which did feel less premium than the 1000's metal shell, but overall the slim model still looked and felt like a premium device. One of the most notable new features was the 1 GB of onboard memory, allowing players to have game saves or to download small games directly onto the system without the need for one of Sony's proprietary memory cards, although, as noted elsewhere, the limit to merely 1 GB of internal space was perhaps too much of a concession and a missed opportunity for Sony to address a major criticism of the original Vita model. The Vita's memory cards also got a price drop, and a new 64 GB memory was released alongside the Slim for 10,479 yen, approximately $100, similar to the original price of the 32 GB memory card. Sony also introduced a variety of colors and designs for the redesigned console. Over time, there were more than 50 designs of the Vita Slim released, including some limited collector releases associated with prominent games. There were 2 drawbacks to the updated system: the Vita's screen and the price. The OLED screen had been universally commended when the Vita launched back in 2011. Even critics of the system praised the vibrant colors and crisp visuals of the Vita's display. It was one of the Vita's most expensive components, but it also set the Vita apart from many similarly priced mobile phones and tablets at the time, helping sell the idea of it being a premium, quality device. The Vita Slim replaced the OLED screen with an LCD display, and side by side, the difference in the sharpness, brightness, and color was obvious. The cheaper screen should have resulted in a price reduction for the Vita, and while the starting price of the Slim model was cheaper than the starting price of the original OLED Vita, due to price drops of the original system, the new model cost the same in North America and most of Europe. In some countries, the launch of the new model actually came with a price increase. For example, in the UK, the Vita 1000 was selling for £150, but the 2000 retailed for £180. This was partly caused by Sony and retailers needing to clear stock of the old model, but optically, this wasn't a favorable start for the new design. Sony's hands were likely tied due to the high cost of producing each Vita unit prior to the Vita's launch. Kaz Hirai, who at the time was Sony Computer Entertainment CEO, stated in an interview with Reuters that Sony was making a loss on every Vita sold, and that the company was not expecting to be turning a profit on the device until 2014. However, this prediction was made before the Vita had launched, and when Sony was still expecting 12 million units to be sold in its first year on market. Given that Sony was not making a profit on each device sold, a further price reduction on the Vita Slim would have caused additional losses for the company. While Sony has never provided details on the Vita's profit per unit, the cheaper production costs of the Slim may have helped Sony to make enough profit so as to warrant the continued production of the Vita up until 2019. The Vita Slim launched in Europe in February 2014 and May of that year in North America. This was to be the only major redesign of the system, an indication of Sony's unwillingness to invest the time and money in R&D and marketing to develop and launch subsequent iterations. As a comparison, the PSP had 5 models released over the course of its 7 years, but the PSP also sold over 80 million units, likely justifying the efforts to remodel the device. Since the Slim's launch, Vita fans have discussed and at times argued which model is better. While the appeal of the original's OLED screen is undeniable, the convenience and utility of the micro USB charger, which was the same one used by most Android phones at the time, on the Slim, was a big plus point. Though the Slim did not introduce any major new features that would significantly change the fortunes of the system as a whole, it did provide a bump in sales in Japan, and the variety of colors and limited edition versions gave Vita collectors an incentive to own multiple systems. Chapter 11. The PS4 Companion. The biggest gaming news of 2013 was the arrival of 2 new consoles, Sony's PlayStation 4 or PS4 and Microsoft's Xbox One XB1. The Vita had launched in the West just a year before the PS4 was announced, but Sony were already showing signs of abandoning the device with only a few minutes dedicated to announcements for the handheld during their E3 2013 presentation. It was during that conference that Jack Tretton, former president and CEO of Sony Computer Entertainment America, said that the Vita would be the ultimate companion to the PS4. Sony had confirmed in May 2013 that all PS4 games would be remote play compatible, allowing gamers to play PS4 titles directly on a Vita. The only exceptions were games that required specific peripherals like the PlayStation 4 camera. Due to the handheld's continued tepid hardware sales, Sony attempted to reposition it as an accessory to their home console, which acted as a large precursor to where their support would be heading. Sony had just 3 big games releasing for the Vita in 2013: Guerrilla Cambridge's One Killzone Mercenary, Media Molecule's Tearaway, and marvelous AQL and SCE Japan Studios' Soul Sacrifice. But they were not expecting sales of the system to improve. Sony predicted only 5 million Vitas and PSPs, they stopped reporting Vita sales on their own in 2012, would sell between April 2013 and May 2014, a fall from 7 million in the previous 12 months. Sony's response to this reduced outlook was to promote the connectivity between the Vita and PS4. Remote Play was not a new feature. Sony had introduced it on the PlayStation Portable and the PS3. In Sony's own words, Remote Play allows a PSP system to connect wirelessly to a PS3 system and transfers some functionality of the PS3 to the PSP system, meaning, with Remote Play, users could stream and play PS3 games on the PSP. Very few PS3 games were playable on the PSP due to the lack of a second analog stick. All PlayStation 1 games were compatible with Remote Play, but it was a feature that would be greatly improved upon with the successors of these 2 systems. A paired Vita could not connect to a PS4. Games would be physically played on the home console, but the content would be streamed to the Vita's screen via an internet connection. The quality of the connection could vary based on the strength of the Wi-Fi or how far away the Vita was from the PS4, but it was possible to play a PS4 game anywhere in the world using a Vita. It was an impressive feature and one that was welcome news to the PlayStation fans intending to own both systems. It was not, however, an adequate substitute for new Vita games. By its very nature, a portable console is meant to be playable anywhere, but to do that you need games native to the system, and without the need for a constant online connection. In an interview with Game Reactor in June 2014, Shuhei Yoshida, president of Sony's worldwide studios, stated that PlayStation has many games in development for the PS Vita. While there were a handful of games being developed or published by Sony for the Vita in 2014, including Helldivers, Counter-Spy, Oreshika, Murasaki Baby, and Freedom Wars, the focus was very much on encouraging indie developers to bring their games to the system and promoting their handheld's connected gaming experiences, Remote Play, and PlayStation Now. Chapter 12. WAAR. What is it good for? At the NGP reveal event in 2011, Sony announced that their new device was capable of augmented reality, or AR, gaming. Few details were given at the time, but in the lead-up to the Vita's launch, more information was provided on how the system's back camera could be used to detect 6 AR play cards in order to create unique experiences that promised to bring new levels of immersive gaming in the palms of players' hands. The showcased games looked impressive, but some were never actually released, and in hindsight, AR was an interesting feature for the Vita that was underutilized and ultimately forgotten. PlayStation was no stranger to AR gaming, having created the iToy for PS2, which introduced games controlled by the player's movement in front of a camera. The Vita was not the first handheld to utilize the feature. The 3DS was also capable of AR gaming, but whereas Nintendo's system could only detect one AR card, the PS Vita implemented Wide Area Augmented Reality Technology, or WAAR, allowing it to detect up to 6 cards to create much larger play areas. Only a handful of other AR titles were released for the Vita, most notable of which were Toy Tanks and Pulsar, alongside the full-priced launch title Reality Fighters. But there were other games that included AR features such as Virtua Tennis 4 and Street Fighter X Tekken, although these were more cosmetic uses rather than gameplay enhancements. 2 games from the Invisimals series were released on the Vita. The first, Invisimals The Alliance, used the play cards, whereas its sequel, Invisimals The Resistance, used smart AR to catch the little creatures in the environment without needing the cards. Released in 2014, this was the final game to make use of the technology and marked the final Sony-published release by developer Novorama after a half-decade exclusivity agreement with Sony. AR gaming had potential, but the titles for Vita felt more like bite-sized showcases for the device's capabilities rather than truly fun and memorable games. They were also held back by the poor camera on the device and the need for bright lighting in order to detect the cards. It was yet another feature of the system that Sony touted ahead of the Vita's launch, but was unfortunately abandoned all too quickly. 3 AR games were available for free at the Vita's launch. Fireworks, compete on online leaderboards to explode fireworks at just the right moment to rack up a high score. Cliff diving, control Dan as he dives from a height into a pool created out of an AR playcard. Table football, also known as soccer for North America users, use 6 AR cards to create a virtual football pitch and flick players around in turn-based matches. Chapter 13. I Want It Now. The games industry was in a strange and unique place in 2012. Nintendo had released its beleaguered Wii U console that year, and mobile gaming had become hugely successful and profitable, to the point that many voices in the industry were predicting that the next PlayStation and Xbox systems would be the last generation of gaming consoles. In an effort to future-proof the PlayStation brand, Sony acquired Gaikai in July 2012, a company that provided a cloud-based gaming service that allowed players to stream high-end PC games to computers, TVs, and tablets. Sony paid $380 million for the company, but very little information was provided on how Gaikai's technology would be incorporated into PlayStation's offering until January 2014. At the January 2014 Consumer Electronics Show, Sony announced their new device branded as PlayStation Now. PlayStation Now would allow users to stream and play PS2, PS3, and eventually PS4 games on PlayStation consoles, Sony Bravia TVs, tablets, the PS TV, and the PlayStation Vita. This was a service with huge potential, provided users had a sufficiently strong Wi-Fi connection and a compatible device. PlayStation's games could be played anywhere and at any time. This was a particularly attractive feature for the Vita. First-party games were drying up on the handheld, but PS Now provided the potential for an endless supply of new AAA games, and the Vita had the advantage over other compatible devices in that it was portable and without the need for a separate controller to play games. PS Now was rolled out slowly across the world, with betas taking place in the US in 2014 and Europe in 2015. However, the service was initially held back by several factors. Pricing. Initially, a subscription was not offered, and users had to rent games with unreasonably high prices, even for older games. Availability. It was initially only available in the US. Even when the service was rolled out to Europe, it was limited to a handful of countries. Wi-Fi. Sony recommended users have an internet speed of 5 megabytes per second. However, in practice, a higher speed was required for an optimum experience. The quality of the service on Vita was not as good as on the PS4, but games were still very playable. Games. Upon launch, the game offering was limited, although this did develop over time. The pricing issue was improved upon when a subscription model was rolled out in the US that allowed unlimited play of games included in the service, but there were still complaints around the monthly subscription fee in Europe of £13 or €15 compared to the $99 per year offer available to US customers. PS4 games were added to the service in July 2017, and Sony announced PS Now for PC in 2016. Sadly, on the 15th of February 2017, the 5th anniversary of the Vita's North American launch, Sony announced the service would be terminated for all devices except the PS4 and PCs. On the European PlayStation blog, Sony's stated reason was, after thoughtful consideration, we decided to shift our focus and resources to PS4 and Windows PC to further develop and improve the user experience on these two devices. This move puts us in the best position to grow the service even further. The PS4 was a sales success, and it dominated the competition. Unsurprisingly, Sony wanted to invest and focus on the device that was selling rather than the device that was not, the PS Vita. However, Vita fans were not happy with the announcement or the explanation. Sony hadn't given the service an adequate chance to be successful on the handheld, given that it was available in only 8 countries at the time of the announcement, and Europe had not received a more affordable subscription package. Presumably, the subscriber numbers didn't justify the cost of supporting PS Now on Vita, but with the pricing and lack of support in many countries, it didn't seem possible for it to be successful on the Vita. PlayStation Now on Vita was not a perfect service, but it was a means for players to access a huge library of classic AAA games, such as Red Dead Redemption or the Uncharted series, which made up for the lack of new big-budget games coming to the handheld. Despite the service being terminated on Vita, PS Now was an example of Sony trying to innovate and invest in the device during 2013 and 2014. It didn't pay off, and 2015 onwards marked a period when Sony began to more openly and actively abandon the Vita. Chapter 14. Near Miss. When the Vita was first revealed, There were those in the gaming industry that wrongly predicted consoles were dying out. Based on the direction of the market, they thought mobile gaming was the future. Sony was clearly influenced by this prediction and so built the Vita with a range of social features and apps to compete with some of the functionality of mobile phones. During the NGP reveal event in 2011, Sony showed off the location-based app Near. It would allow players to find other nearby Vita owners, become friends with them, play online games with them, view a list of games that were popular in the local area, and collect in-game rewards called discoveries. For example, unlockable music tracks in Super Stardust Delta or treasures in Uncharted Golden Abyss. Sony's expectations was that players would want the 3G model Vita in order to connect to Near regularly while they were out and about. However, they overestimated the uptake of the 3G system, as buyers were more interested in the cheaper Wi-Fi-only model. Nintendo's Street Pass application on the 3DS was hugely popular and worked by automatically searching and exchanging data when two devices were connected to the same Wi-Fi network, even if the consoles were in sleep mode. Nier had arguably more features than Street Pass. Discovering new games and unlocking in-game items were particularly compelling additions, but it required users to actively open the app and perform a search while connected to a Wi-Fi network. As Nier was less user-friendly, it ended up being used less. In January 2015, PlayStation announced they would be ending support for the app. This was not, however, the only social application on the device. The Vita had a messaging app to communicate with other PSN users, as well as an app named Party, which allowed you to form a group of players to chat and play games together. Game purchases and trophy unlocks were displayed as activities, allowing players to see what their PSN friends had been playing and comment on their achievements. At launch, apps for Facebook, Twitter, and Flickr were also available for download. Sony had the foresight to incorporate the functionality to capture screenshots by tapping the Start button and the PlayStation button at the same time. With the social apps available for Vita, these images could be easily shared with others. Twitter proved especially popular with Vita owners, sharing game screenshots under the hashtag PSVitaShare for more than 10 years after the system's launch. The Vita launched at a time when smartphones were becoming ubiquitous, and social apps such as Facebook were hugely popular. The PSP had also been praised for its multimedia features at launch, but these had rapidly lost ground towards the tail end of the handheld's life, as mobile phones could now do everything too. Sony saw the mobile market as a competitor to the Vita and so incorporated features from phones into their newest handheld. The presence of this functionality and these apps did not lead to system purchases, but they were fun distractions, and it was a novel way to share achievements with friends. At a time when the games media was writing off the Vita as dead, turning on Nier and finding other local players enjoying the games you love was an enjoyable way to feel connected with the Vita community. Chapter 15. Can you kick it? By the end of 2015, Sony had given up on supporting the Vita with new software, ending their run of titles with the moderately well-received Big Fest in December. The majority of big third-party publishers had long since abandoned the device, with Bandai Namco and Square Enix being notable exceptions, the former working on the device until 2017 and the latter releasing games all the way up to the end of 2019. While this was disappointing for Vita fans, the system was still very much a viable device with games continuing to be released in the West, mainly from independent developers and publishers of localized Japanese games. Disappointingly, the period from 2014 onwards was also plagued by cancellation of games announced to be coming to the system, including some highly anticipated titles. Developing for Vita was a greater financial risk for developers given the relatively small user base compared to other systems. But if the funds could be secured while the game was still in development, then that risk would be reduced significantly. Enter Kickstarter. The crowdfunding site grew in prominence in 2012 as a tool for video game developers to raise funds by allowing fans to support the development of projects that they were interested in. One of the first big success stories was the point-and-click adventure game Broken Age, which raised $3 million in funding, significantly exceeding its original target of $400,000. A string of high-profile Kickstarter successes followed over the years, with developers promising to release their titles on Vita. However, not all those promises were fulfilled. Mighty No. 9, helmed by Mega Man series veteran Keiji Inafune, famously raised $3.8 million, more than 4 times the amount asked. Yet the handheld versions of both the 3DS and Vita never materialized, with no explanation or announced cancellation from the developers. This was an infamous exception among the Vita title cancellations. Most developers, at the very least, announced the cancellation of the Vita versions of their titles and provided refunds to backers, but this was not the case for Mighty No. 9. Other high-profile Kickstarter cancellations included acclaimed titles such as The Banner Saga, Moon Hunters, Hyper Light Drifter, and Children of Mortar. These were sore disappointments to the Vita fans that expressly backed the projects for that version of the game. Vita owners had a reputation for buying games and supporting Kickstarter projects that promised games for their favorite handheld. In order to capitalize on this market, some developers promised to port their game to the system before they had actually researched whether it was feasible in the first place. One of the biggest blows for Vita owners was Bloodstained: Ritual of the Night. The title was spearheaded by Koji Igarashi, who was famous for his role in developing Castlevania Symphony of the Night, considered by many to be one of the best games on the PS1. The game raised $5.5 million, the largest funded Kickstarter project at the time, and although it was originally planned for launch in 2017, development delays meant that it eventually released in 2019. Although a Vita version had been promised, in August 2018, it was announced that the version was being cancelled, following the earlier cancellation of a Wii U version in 2017. In a Kickstarter project update, it was stated that this decision is largely due to Sony's plans to discontinue the Vita console, ending production of physical copies and stopping certain online store support features. Bloodstained was eventually released for multiple platforms, including the Nintendo Switch. However, the Switch version suffered from many bugs and performance issues, including one glitch that prevented the game from being finished if players did not install an update patch before playing. Given how the game played on the Switch, it was likely the Vita version would have been far worse. The cancellation was frustrating for many fans, of course, but a subpar port on the Vita would have been just as disappointing, if not more so. When a developer launched a Kickstarter for a game pledging that it will come to Vita, they were committing to not only complete their game, but that they would ensure that it actually released on the system and also delivered on all their promises. After all that, there was still no guarantee the game would even be good. It wasn't all bad news, though. There were some prominent success stories, such as Slain, Time Spinner, Cosmic Star Heroine, Muv-Luv, Pato Box, and Shantai, Half Genie Hero. Two particularly famous crowdfunded Vita success stories were Darkest Dungeon and Shovel Knight. Neither game actually promised a Vita version in their Kickstarters, but they delivered them anyway thanks to fan feedback. Both were also critical hits and continued to be supported with additional content and performance patches up to 2019, delivering well beyond the promises of their Kickstarters. In 2012, Kickstarter was huge. It seemed like the best place to discover new and unique titles. It helped developers make their games a reality and allowed gamers to directly support the development of the titles they wanted to play. Over the years, the shine has faded, and Vita fans in particular have had to endure disappointment after disappointment, with a string of cancellations. But for all the frustrations, there have also been successes like Shovel Knight, or darkest dungeon that proved crowdfunding could result in stellar games being developed that far exceeded expectations. Chapter 16. Hacked. Sony's first handheld, the PlayStation Portable, sold close to 80 million units, successful enough to justify them launching a successor system. But for game publishers, it was not a viable platform for releasing games, particularly towards the end of its life due to the ease with which it could be hacked. In a 2009 interview with GameIndustry.biz, Sony Computer Entertainment America's senior VP of marketing at the time, Peter Dill, confirmed a report figure that around 50 million PSPs had been hacked. The result? Owners pirated software, which significantly damaged sales and led to developers and publishers abandoning the device prematurely. Dissidia, Final Fantasy, was an example of this. In 2010, it was reported that the game had been pirated 5 million times compared to 2 million of sales. Ruwira Surya, creative director of Ready at Dawn Studios, developers of God of War, Chains of Olympus, and God of War Ghost of Sparta for PSP, stated in 2010, "On the PSP, piracy is pretty rampant now all around the world. It's getting to the point where it doesn't make sense to make games on it if the piracy keeps on increasing." The damage to the PSP was clear. To avoid lightning striking twice, Sony built the Vita to withstand being hacked, which was one of the reasons they had opted to use costly proprietary memory cards, although it's arguable that the criticism the device suffered for its memory cards had a bigger impact on its success than the risk of hacking. The PSP was hacked within weeks of its launch, and the ease with which the system could be exploited was part of the reason it was so prevalent. Thankfully, the Vita took far longer for a viable and easy-to-enable hack to be made available. That came in July 2016 when a group of developers named Team Molecule released the infamous Henkaku hack. The group stated that we carefully designed Henkaku to be as permissive as possible for developers to write home brew. However, we also made sure to make it as difficult as possible to repurpose our tools to enable piracy. While piracy is always inevitable, we will not make it easy. The simple installation of the exploit allowed custom applications to be installed on the Vita, including emulators to run games from retro devices. The Vita became a retro gamer's dream system, with its ability to play every legacy system up to and including the Nintendo 64, although N64 games did not all run well. The PSP and PS1 games that were never released on the PlayStation Network could now be played on Vita, including Kingdom Hearts, Birth by Sleep, and Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, two of the PSP's best games that were noticeable for their absence on the PSP's digital library. But retro emulation wasn't the only advantage of a hacked Vita. Over time, homebrew programmers released many new applications and add-ons to the Vita. Some of the more famous of these include Overclock. The Overclock exploit allowed users to unlock more of the system's CPU, providing improved performance to games. For example, games that previously suffered from slowdown would run better, such as Borderlands 2. However, this did increase the risk of overheating and damaging the system's life in the long run. Video streaming. The Vita did not have an HDMI slot to play games on a TV, but a hacked device could allow users to stream game footage to a PC via the Vita's USB charging slot. Translations. Many games were released for Vita exclusively in Japan. To overcome the language barrier, translation patches could be installed, allowing subtitles to be displayed in alternate languages. Western Vita gamers that were sorely disappointed not to be able to play titles such as I Am Setsuna or Dragon Quest Heroes 2 could play and understand them after enabling Henkaku on their device. SD compatibility. An exploit could be installed to allow the use of the far cheaper and far more widely available SD memory cards for storage. Using a specially designed cartridge with a slot for an SD card, Vita owners were able to hold hundreds of gigabytes of data rather than the maximum storage of 64 gigabytes offered by Sony's own Vita cards. Porting Android and PC games. It was far from a simple process, but homebrew developers were able to port games launched for Android or Steam to the Vita. Famously, Rockstar's PS2 games, including Grand Theft Auto 3, Vice City, and San Andreas, could all be played on a Vita, and those versions were in many ways better than the official remasters later released for the Nintendo Switch. As with the PSP, Sony was running a losing race with hackers by trying to release patches that closed the system's exploits, only to have them broken days later in some cases. Hacking a Vita was not as straightforward as it was for its predecessor system, but once the device had been cracked, there was no way for Sony to completely stop the spread. The version of Hankaku required the Vita to be running a specific firmware version and to email a file in order to install the exploit. That version of Hankaku had to be reinstalled each time a system was shut down. However, over time it became easier to hack the device with a permanent hack being introduced and new exploits being available to download from a PSN-like store that could be installed directly on a Vita. Piracy is wrong. When developers spend their time and money to release their game on Vita, stealing that game is inherently wrong. But a hacked system could bring advantages and quality of life improvements to players far beyond piracy. Homebrew developers were supporting the system with new workarounds in their spare time and for no reward, which, in 2021 and beyond, was more than Sony was willing to do. For players, it opened up new possibilities for what the Vita was capable of, and it provided the device with added longevity for those willing to take the time and realize the full potential of the system. Chapter 17. Unlimited. Few could have predicted that one relatively unknown Vita game, Breach and Clear, could be the start of a huge and growing industry of collectible game releases. Developed by the studio Mighty Rabbit, Breach and Clear was a strategic game that was released digitally in May 2015 to average reviews and little fanfare. In order to keep the studio afloat, Douglas Bogart and Josh Fairhurst decided to produce a small order of just 1,500 physical copies of the game and attempt to sell them. This was the start of limited-run games. From that first release, the company went on to produce and sell physical copies of over 100 Vita titles, and have also branched out into releases for other systems and grown from a two-man operation to a hugely successful organization with a devout fan base in just a few years. As with most industries, success breeds competition, and the limited physical game market was no exception. Numerous competitors have launched since 2015, which has resulted in over 200 physical game releases for the Vita sold outside of traditional retail channels. These releases have been particularly appealing to the Vita community since many fans of the system are avid collectors. While owning a physical copy of a popular title can seem attractive, like with most things in life, there are pros and cons to this market. One of the biggest reasons in favor of these limited physical releases is game preservation. The all-digital future has been touted as an inevitability for all entertainment industries, and while there are advantages in the form of convenient and easy access to content and cheaper distribution of games for publishers, there is a valid concern that games bought digitally may one day no longer be available. A famous example of this was horror demo PT on the PS4, developed by Metal Gear Solid creator Hideo Kojima. After a falling out between him and his former employer, Konami, the company removed PT from the PlayStation Network, including not allowing previous owners to download the game again. Over the years, Vita games have also suffered a similar fate, mostly due to publishers losing the licensing rights to characters in their games. Examples include Digimon Story, Cyber Sleuth, One Piece Unlimited World Red, and Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Many of these titles were removed without any formal announcement or notice from the publisher. Fortunately, however, these Vita games were all still available to re-download from previous purchases of the titles. This was not the case for PlayStation Mobile titles. Once the service was discontinued, the games could no longer be re-downloaded, even by those who had accumulated a large library of purchased games. For this reason, having physical versions of high-profile titles was very appealing to those that wanted access to them long after PlayStation Network support ceases for the Vita. Being able to release their games physically has also proved to be hugely important to developers, particularly for Vita releases. Due to the small number of Vita owners compared to other platforms, sales were, of course, lower. Being able to release their titles physically as well as digitally gave developers an extra income stream and therefore more incentive to port their games to the system. One of the biggest problems with these limited releases was the fact that they were indeed limited. Small numbers of carts were printed to reduce the risk of copies being left over and unsold. But when games have a print run of just 1,000 units and Vita collectors exceed that number, it inevitably attracts the attention of those wanting to make a quick profit by buying and reselling these games at an excessive markup, also known as scalpers. Vita games sold for $25 by the distributor have been priced far in excess of that in order to profit from the desire of true fans to have a complete collection of games. Vita collectors became used to the stress of mashing the F5 key on Fridays at 10 a.m. Eastern US time, when a new release was going live from limited-run games in order to try and snag an elusive copy. It was not uncommon for a new release to sell out in a minute, to the great disappointment of many fans that had missed out. Limited-run games has had to deal with much criticism over the years, particularly from fans disappointed at missing out on a game release that they desperately wanted. They have been accused of not doing enough to combat the presence of scalpers, compounded by the company allowing purchases of more than one copy per buyer for games with very small print runs. Frustratingly for buyers, games have also been sold with bugs. A competitor in the market, Red Arc Games, released a physical copy of Dear God which ran poorly on the Vita, while the Vita release of Night Trap by Limited Run Games drew much criticism as a bug meant it could not be completed. It was finally patched nearly 12 months after the original release. In March 2019, Sony ended production of Vita cartridges in the West, which impacted almost all the limited-release Vita game sellers. Limited-run games staggered their final Vita releases into 2020, but this left the Hong Kong-based publisher East Asia Soft in a unique position. Their positioning in the Asian market has meant that they have continued to have access to new Vita carts, which has ensured new titles being signed up for physical runs well into 2020, and also makes them the only company in the market able to offer this to developers. Like limited-run games, East Asia Soft's background was game development. Their first release was Soldner X Himmelsstürmer on the PS3 and PC, and has more recently expanded to Rainbow Skies on PS3, PS4, and Vita. The company moved into publishing physical and digital games and released 29 Vita physicals between 2015 and 2019. While not perfect, it's undeniable that limited-run games started a spark in the industry that lit a fire under game collectors and launched numerous competitors. While the Vita was already a system popular for game collectors, the emergence of these companies was not only appreciated by fans wanting to own a physical copy of their favorite games, but also for developers considering bringing their games to the system.
Love PlayStation? Then check out my Etsy store for a range of books about PlayStation's history, my magazine RPM, the unofficial retro PlayStation magazine, and custom manuals for PS4, PS5, and PS Vita games. The link is in the description.
Chapter 18. The Mobile Future. It was clear from the first reveal of the Vita that Sony saw mobile phones as the device's key competitor. but also an area for opportunity for the PlayStation brand. At the NGP event in January 2011, they announced PlayStation Suite, an initiative that aimed to bring Sony's content to Android devices, provided they were PlayStation certified. Few details were given at the time, but it was later clarified that they were creating essentially a new video game storefront which would work across the Vita and specific Android devices with a range of cheaper games to compete with the titles on Google Play and Apple's App Store. PlayStation presumably thought they had the brand name and recognition to disrupt the mobile gaming market and create a competitor to the established players. However, it ultimately failed to take off. This was not Sony's first foray into pushing smaller indie titles. The PlayStation Mini brand brought a range of budget games with small file sizes to the PSP and PS3. These titles were also compatible with the Vita. Almost 300 games released for the service, but it was discontinued and replaced with PS Mobile in 2012. At launch, 21 games were available, including notable titles such as Super Crate Box, developed by the popular indie studio Vlambeer, Rebel by Pom Pom Games, and Fueled Tirakas by FutureLab. It was a welcome boost to the Vita's library of available games, and prices started at just 40 pence or 49 cents. In all, over 200 games launched under the PS Mobile brand, but for fans of PlayStation, it was missing two key features: the ability to play multiplayer games, and perhaps, most importantly, trophy support. In October 2012, the head of content acquisition at Sony, Sarah Thompson, told The Verge that PlayStation trophies and online leaderboards would be implemented soon. However, likely due to the lack of success of the service, it did not come to fruition. Leading up to its launch, PS Mobile received lots of praise, and it was hoped that it would improve Android gaming in general. Having a targeted range of devices to build games for meant developers could spend less time trying to optimize their titles for dozens of different devices and focus instead on developing quality titles that ran well on select phones. But it was held back by the fact that the PS Mobile storefront was not available to download from Google Play, the primary Android storefront. It had to be sideloaded onto devices, which was not a complicated process, but seemed to be enough of a hurdle to turn off potential customers. For those that did install the store app, they may have been disappointed that a service titled PlayStation Mobile was made up largely of indie games rather than Sony's big-budget franchises. Sony should be praised for trying something new and trying to future-proof themselves. However, PS Mobile became yet another service to be cancelled by PlayStation. The writing was on the wall. After being heavily touted in 2012 as a major new initiative for Sony, by 2014, the PlayStation blog only mentioned it a handful of times. Between the mediocre sales of the Vita, the lack of customers' interest in the service on Android, and the growing trend of freemium titles on mobile, PS Mobile faced an uphill struggle from day one of its launch. It was eventually shut down in September 2015. The PS Mobile section of the store was entirely removed, preventing games from ever being purchased again. But worse still, prior purchases could not be re-downloaded. If a Vita owner lost or reset their device, those PS Mobile purchases could never be retrieved. This was especially disappointing given the quality of some of the releases. Some titles did eventually launch natively on the Vita, but there were those such as previously mentioned Rebel and Tokyo Jungle Mobile that were only released on PS Mobile and had no other legitimate way of being played. PS Mobile was another example of the company's continued support of indie developers, and it resulted in some critically acclaimed titles and unique experiences coming to the Vita. Perhaps if Sony had instead focused on encouraging those indie developers to release their titles natively on Vita, it would have helped shake the lingering perception that the Vita had no games. Chapter 19. Lookbooks. By 2018, new releases for the Vita fell predominantly into two categories: indie titles and games from Japan. The number of big-budget releases was diminishing, but one genre continued to flourish on the system: visual novels. The history of visual novels dates back to the 1980s, with the release of the Portopia serial murder case. While it was itself inspired by other Western games in the adventure genre, its style and approach to storytelling established the template for the genre and can still be seen in visual novel titles today. This subset of games is characterized by text-based interactive storytelling with characters overlaid on a static background. Some may include puzzle elements, while others offer branching conversation choices which can lead to multiple endings. Over 50 titles in this genre have been released for the Vita in the West. That number is far larger if including Japan-only releases, including popular series such as the Zero Escape trilogy, the Danganronpa series, and the Steins Gate series. Although the majority of visual novels were developed in Japan, more recently indie devs have been inspired to branch into the genre. VA11 Hawley and 2064 Read-Only Memories being two notable and well-received examples. The effort to release these games to a Western audience cannot be overstated. While they may not be as complex from a coding perspective as the AAA big-budget console games, language skills, time, effort, and a hell of a lot of dedication are required to properly localize the games so the story translates effectively to a non-Japanese audience. It's not just a case of rewriting the words into a different language. The slang, pop culture references, and subtler expressions need to be carefully rewritten in order for fans to appreciate the intricate plots in the best way possible. The popularity of visual novels on Vita can partly be explained by the nature of the genre itself. These titles will include hours of reading, and while many of them are available on the PlayStation 4 or PC, it's not ideal to read the equivalent of a book sitting in front of a TV or monitor. Visual novels may also have found a home in Vita due to the system having less weekly releases compared to other gaming systems, which prompted owners to experiment and try out some titles that they may not have otherwise played. Handhelds have traditionally been the ideal place for this type of game, as can also be demonstrated by the success of the Phoenix Wright series on the Nintendo DS, and the Vita turned out to be an ideal system for visual novels with gamers willing to explore unfamiliar niche genres. Chapter 20. Going for Platinum. Mayonnaise. It's not just a tasty condiment, it was also the theme of the game that started a trend of PlayStation releases known for offering easy platinum trophies. Trophies were launched on the PlayStation 3 in 2008 and Super Stardust HD. They were required to be implemented on every subsequent PS3 title, giving players a virtual reward for achieving a specific feat in a game, the most coveted of which was the Platinum, which would only unlock after all other trophies had been attained. Trophies were popular among the PlayStation community, and so when Sony announced in 2011 that all Vita games would also implement the system, fans were excited for the possibility of earning trophies while playing on the go. For many years, it was thought that Platinum trophies could only be assigned to retail or high-profile game releases, but that was proven false. Famously so in November 2016, when developer Green Lava Studios launched My Name is Mayo for the PS4 and Vita. The game involved tapping the Vita screen or PS4 controller buttons repeatedly, and eventually, a Platinum trophy would unlock. This release seemingly opened the floodgates for small, cheap, indie releases with easy Platinums, some of which could be earned in minutes. A community of fans that sought to improve their trophy ranking ate up these games with YouTube videos providing guidance on the method for attaining these trophies as quickly as possible. One company became famous, or perhaps infamous, for releasing titles with fast and easy Platinum trophies: Ratalaika Games. The publisher and porting studio based in Spain worked with many developers to bring games to consoles including the Vita. These titles tended to be low price and had trophies that would all unlock in potentially less than 30 minutes. In many cases, the Platinum Trophy would even unlock before the game was completed. These virtual achievements, when implemented in the right way, could be beneficial to a game and provide an incentive for players to see all that was on offer. But it could also be disenchanting to see a Platinum Trophy pop up on the screen before the halfway point had even been reached. Ratalaika faced criticism, but there was clearly a demand for games that approached trophies in this way, and for Vita owners, the company was responsible for dozens of new titles being released on the system. While some of their releases were considered mediocre, between 2018 and 2019, they launched 23% of all games on the device across a wide variety of genres. Notably, they continued to publish games for the Vita into 2020. In 2019, the company stated that sales of their titles on Vita did not justify the cost and effort of porting them to the system, but the company continued to release them anyway, giving Vita owners a steady stream of titles to play on their favorite handheld long after other developers and publishers had given up on it. Chapter 21. The End? For Vita, the end had been on the cards for some time. It was not a successful system, and its demise was inevitable. Perhaps the beginning of the process was in March 2015, when Sony blamed the Vita and PSTV for a loss of $93 million in their annual financial results. For a company like Sony, who, after a number of years of financial difficulties, were finally seeing success with the PS4, it seemed that the Vita was a stain on their record that they preferred not to talk about. The PSTV was even less successful than its portable counterpart, and was discontinued in 2016, just 2 years after its launch. PS Mobile, another failed initiative, was terminated in July 2015, and PlayStation Now support was removed from the system in 2017. Sony ceased talking about the Vita at their annual E3 presentation after 2014, and even support for smaller services such as the Near app that Sony heavily touted as their answer to the Nintendo DS's Street Pass system was discontinued. It was May 2018 which acted as a turning point, though, and the start of a constant and steady flow of bad news that ultimately resulted in the device's formal discontinuation. On the 16th of May 2018, Sony announced the production of Vita cartridges in the West would end in early 2019. For game collectors, this was a massive blow. Limited-run games and other Western sellers of Vita games were faced with the imminent end of a popular and successful part of their business, and developers had less incentive to bring their games to the system, as the potential for profit was severely impacted if they couldn't release a physical version of their title. Cartridge production officially ended in the West in March 2019, yet, somewhat fortunately, this production end was not implemented in Asia, where the device was more popular. East Asia Soft, another seller of limited print titles, supported the system and sold Vita games via their website, play-asia.com, beyond 2019 and up to the end of 2021. Just months later, in an interview with Famitsu, Sony Interactive Entertainment Senior Vice President, Hiroyuki Oda, confirmed that there would be no Vita successor. Given the device's performance, this wasn't overly surprising, although many fans held out hope that the stellar sales of the Nintendo Switch would demonstrate to Sony that there was a market for portable gaming systems. Not since the Dreamcast had a major console maker released a device with no successor to replace it. The final nail in the coffin came in February 2019. Sony announced the production of Vita systems would cease before April of that year, and in fact, Sony didn't even make it that far. On the 2nd of March 2019, Sony announced they were no longer manufacturing the PlayStation Vita anywhere in the world. Chapter 22. Forever Physical. Following Sony's decision to end production of PS Vita cartridges, East Asia Soft was the only publisher of physical Vita games in 2021. The end of global cartridge production had been rumored as far back as March 2020, so East Asia Soft submitted around 24 games to Sony before the deadline in early 2021, which they subsequently slowly released through that year. As a result of this rushed deadline, where previously all games coming to Vita must be released digitally, some of the games being released were exclusively physical. This began with the visual novel Nicole in September 2020. When Sony announced in October 2020 that the web and mobile stores for Vita and PS3 would be closing, this decision made it harder for Vita fans to find and buy games. The store could still be accessed on the Vita itself, but the functionality was not especially user-friendly, as recently released titles did not always show up in the new games list, and games were missing from the store on the device. This news also had another impact. Developers were now more reluctant to release games digitally for Vita. For example, developer Luc Bernard from Arcade Distillery cited this change as one of the reasons they would not release their game Death Tales digitally. In addition to this, developers had to pay fees to rating boards in different regions in order to release games digitally to the Vita. With the diminishing player base and Sony's lack of willingness to update the store, digital releases were a risky proposition due to the upfront costs involved. Another factor was piracy, which was growing on the Vita and further eroded game sales. In contrast, publishing games physically through East Asia Soft was a guaranteed source of income, since new games would often sell out within minutes due to the dedication of Vita collectors. In total, 15 physical-only games were released for Vita by East Asia Soft. The quality of these releases varied, however. Titles such as Unmetal and Horizon Chase Turbo were praised by fans, but there were others that had broken trophies, for example, Death Tales, while some were short, mediocre releases that some fans felt did not justify the cost, for example Skull Pirates and The Lost Cube. Despite this, there is no doubt that East Asia Soft provided an important service to Vita fans, and it's thanks to them that some games made it to the system at all. Flying Oak Games, developers of the excellent roguelike Scourgebringer, said that the game would likely have skipped the Vita entirely if it had not been for East Asia Soft approaching them to publish physically. Esther Sanchez, CEO of Resistance Studios and developer of Pushy and Pulley in Blockland, stated that she did not want to release her game digitally due to the lack of Vita players willing to spend money, alongside the time and effort to publish on the different regional storefronts and Sony's QA process, a criticism echoed by other developers. She stated that if she had not been able to release the game physically, there would not have been a Vita port at all. These 15 releases all had print runs of around 1,000 copies, which left many Vita fans disappointed when they missed out on a title. Since there was no digital release, anyone that did not secure a copy would have no other legitimate way to play them on the handheld. New games available to play should always be a positive, but due to the costs of the physical games being significantly more than if they had been released on the Vita PSN store, particularly when shipping costs are factored in, and the underwhelming quality of some titles, Vita fans were becoming more disillusioned as time went on and as games were revealed. By December 2021, when the final physical Vita games had been sold, there were mixed emotions from fans. Sadness that there would be no new releases, and relief that the stresses associated with trying to be quick enough to secure a copy was over. Chapter 23. Killing Me Slowly. You may think Sony ending production of the Vita would be the end of the story of the handheld, but there seemed to be a steady stream of bad news for fans throughout 2020 and 2021. In March 2020, publishers were informed that Sony would be changing the systems used to publish and update games on the PSN Store. While this change reportedly made the process easier for publishing and managing PS4 titles, it removed the option to put Vita and PS3 games on sale. Publishers will often see a significant boost in revenue when their game goes on sale, and many buyers will likewise wait for titles to be discontinued before purchasing them. This change in approach meant that unless a game was cross-buy, the Vita version is included when you buy the PS4 version, it could never be discounted. Titles such as Uncharted, Golden Abyss, Gravity Rush, Persona 4 Golden, and many more, including PSP and PS1 games, would no longer see price reductions. Another impact was that when Vita fans bought discounted cross-buy PS4 titles, the sale would be registered as a PS4 purchase, giving Sony and publishers the impression that games are not selling on Vita. In May 2020, Ratalaika Games, publishers of over 60 indie-developed games for Vita, revealed that the European Games Rating Board, PEGI, would be increasing the cost of rating games from €250 to €1,450, an increase of nearly 600%. This was hugely impactful to Vita more than any other system due to the low number of people buying games for the platform. Ratalaika had previously stated that they make barely any money when they release a Vita game, and as more and more people moved over to playing on the Switch, that number was continuing to fall. A large increase in the rating agency costs would wipe out any potential profit for releases in Europe. There was an option to release games in North America only since the rating agency costs were not changing there, but the publisher cited that the cost and effort to port a game to Vita could not be justified to launch in just one region. This marks a winding down of the publisher's support for the Vita. Ratalaika had been responsible for dozens of games coming to the system, and at times, they were releasing titles on a weekly basis. While not all games were well received, there were some gems amongst the library, and it was disappointing to lose a source of so much new content. PEGI later reversed the decision to increase their fees, but Ratalaika had already decided to end support of the system. Their last digital Vita game, Thy Sword, was released in May 2020. Throughout 2020 and 2021, the Vita store had numerous issues. For example, the search functionality stopped working for 3 weeks in July 2020. Users could not download games for weeks in December 2020. Games redeemed via a PS Plus subscription could not be downloaded for most of October 2021. The store stopped allowing searching, downloading, and purchasing of games in November 2021. And there were numerous cases of error messages popping up when users logged into the store. Sony were clearly implementing changes or fixes to the store, but in doing so, they were causing errors that then took weeks to be fixed. Vita fans could not escape the feeling that Sony was finding ways to make it harder for them to support the Vita. In October 2020, Sony announced that they would be closing the web and mobile stores for Vita and PS3 games. This made it harder for players to find and buy games. There were Vita titles that were only available via the web store. For example, the stellar RPG Romancing Saga 3 and the popular PSP third-person shooter The Third Birthday. The Vita store had never been particularly user-friendly, and new games did not even show up on there at times. Given that developers had to pay fees to rating boards to release their games on the system, and then may not even have their game available to buy due to the way Sony manages the store, it's astonishing that developers continued to support the console. 1 year later, in October 2021, Sony announced that purchases on the Vita store could no longer be made using PayPal or credit card. While this was likely done to minimize security risks associated with different payment methods, the games could still be bought using prepaid cards. It put yet another obstacle in place for Vita owners trying to purchase new games. In March 2021, Sony made the shocking and hugely disappointing announcement that they would be closing the Vita and PS3 stores permanently. The story first broke by the website The Gamer, and Sony followed up with an official announcement. Fans were dismayed, but worse still, Sony did not communicate the news to developers that were in the process of making games for the system. The schedule meant that new game releases would stop by July 2021, and developers had to submit their titles in advance of this as part of the submission process. Previously purchased games could still be re-downloaded. As a result, Vita games in development were cancelled, including new titles by Lilimo Games, Pablo Schecker, and numerous Kickstarter projects, such as Lazar and Thief's Roulette. Sony faced significant backlash as a result of this announcement, and so 1 month later, they reversed the decision to close the store. In a post on the PlayStation blog, President and CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment, Jim Ryan, cited the incredibly passionate fans as the result of the change of heart. Purchases would continue, but they were unclear on whether developers would be able to release their games beyond July 2021. At the time, Sony was facing criticism for other decisions, including opting not to create a sequel to the PS4 game Days Gone and instead choosing to remake The Last of Us, which had already had a re-release. It was encouraging to see a big company reverse a bad decision as a result of fan feedback, but Sony did state that the Vita store would not be closing for the foreseeable future. This was not a permanent arrangement by any means. It was later confirmed in May 2021 that the decision to stop new releases was in place. Patches for existing games would also be stopped, meaning that any glitches and bugs could not be fixed. Developers had until July 10th to submit new games to Sony, and the last day to publish games would be July 21st. 6 games released on this day: Brotherhood United, Killer Dolls United, Mind Maze, Russian Subway Dogs, which was by far the best game on the list, and was a superb final release for the Vita in general, Ultra Mission, and Witchcrafty. These were the last digital games available, but unfortunately, not all titles being developed for the system were able to launch in time for the deadline. The twin-stick arcade shooter Seraphim, which had been in development for over 4 years by Studio Ravenheart, was unable to make it in time despite assistance from Sony. Ultimately, with only 4 months' notice provided by Sony, Seraphim and other games could not be finished in time. After 9.5 years and more than 900 native games released for the system, alongside hundreds of PSP and PS1 titles, 2021 saw the end of new releases for the Vita. Chapter 24: Altered History. In April 2021, a former Sony employee did an AMA Ask Me Anything on Reddit and shed some new light on their former employer's opinion of the Vita and the rationale for wanting to shut down the Vita store. The individual left Sony at an unspecified time, but when he left, new Vita games were selling less than 1,000 copies in their launch weeks. Given the majority of a game's sales happen when a title launches, this was considered poor performance. He said that at Sony, we'd theorize it was the result of the quality of the games, the user base, and the rise of the hacking scene. The comment about the hacking scene came up multiple times during the AMA, and it seemed like this had a significant impact on Sony's views of the Vita. With regards to the announcement that the Vita store would be closing, he said that it was likely due to the cost and effort of running the store. He could not confirm if Sony was at the point where the money they made from the store was less than the cost of upkeep, but he did say there's more to running a digital storefront than just keeping servers online. Payment systems require a lot of technical maintenance, and deprecated systems provide easy attack vectors for sensitive information. And there's a ton of work involved, in making sure everyone gets their money when sales are processed. So Sony may still have been making money from the store, but the effort to run it may not justify the money that they were making. He stated that killing the Vita had been on the cards since 2016 or 2017. As soon as firmware was broken, it was on the chopping block. After the nightmare that was the 2011 hack, Sony is terrified of the word hack or any potential network intrusions. Prior to the firmware hack, Sony were fine with letting the Vita live on, supported by their third-party partners and providing minimalistic support. This attitude clearly drastically and suddenly changed when the firmware was broken, and I don't believe we'd be where we are today if that hadn't happened. The Henkaku hack was released publicly in 2016, and while the original exploit did not allow piracy of Vita games or online cheating, this had developed in the years that followed. Homebrew developers had created amazing tools and opened up new functionality for the Vita, including the use of cheaper SD cards for game storage and the ability to stream games to a PC. But according to this former Sony employee, the hack ultimately sped up the demise of the device. Theoretically, if the Vita had not been hacked, Sony would not have to close the store to new games as quickly as they did. They would have not stopped the production of Vita cards, and would not have discontinued production of the console. There is no way to know if this is true, but it goes some way to explaining Sony's reluctance to support the Vita and to end its life while developers were still willing to release games on the system and users continued to support it, albeit in reducing numbers. During the AMA, the individual also revealed that the Vita had sold around 17 million units. Sony had never revealed the final sales numbers, although they were estimated to be between 15 to 20 million. The Vita therefore outsold Nintendo's Wii U and Sega's Dreamcast, although this was less than a quarter of the sales of its predecessor, the PSP. When discussing Sony's lack of support for the device, he said, "When 2012 and 2013 sales numbers came in, there was hesitation to substantially invest in its longevity. When the Vita Slim and PSTV didn't help, they were pretty much resigned to let third-party partners keep it alive in 2014 to 2016. When the firmware got broken, they started trying to actively kill it in 2016 to 2017. He revealed that there were requests within the organization to allow the use of SD cards and to permit multiple PSN accounts to be used, but these features were not taken forward due to hacking fears. Although it took some years, the Vita did ultimately get hacked, but the optics of the memory card prices hurt the system's sales permanently. A key theme from these revelations was Sony's fears around their systems being hacked. It took more than 3 years for the Vita to be compromised, longer than the PSP and DS. But this fear drove them to implement the proprietary memory cards which hugely damaged the sales of the Vita, and once it had been hacked, they accelerated the demise of the system. Given that Sony refused to discuss the Vita for years, the AMA provided an insightful glimpse into the rationale behind Sony's lack of support for the device. Chapter 25. It Means Life. Poor sales, no games, little support. It's a wonder that the Vita managed to remain in production for so long and continue to have new titles released over 8 years after its launch. For all the talk of Sony's mistakes, there were some things they did right that few can fault them on. Namely, that they made a device that's relatively easy to develop games for, yet powerful enough to run high-quality games and is comfortable for gamers to play. This goes some way to explain why developers, particularly indies, continued to release their titles for the Vita. But it isn't the only reason. Sales. Despite having an install base of less than 15% compared to the PS4, cross-platform game sales were proportionately more than 15% on Vita, resulting in the commonly quoted reputation that Vita owners buy games. Thomas Altenberger from Flying Oak Games, developers of Neurovoider, said in an interview, "Based on all the stories that we had heard about the Vita, we were not expecting a thing in terms of sales. We made the port exclusively because we could, and because we felt like the fans deserved it. Ultimately, those stories were proven wrong, because the game did okay on the Vita, more than on Xbox. By July 2018, Neurovoider on Vita had sold 50% of what the PS4 version had, despite a later release on a smaller install base. Impressively, their second Vita release, Scourgebringer, sold almost as much in its first month on sale on Vita as it did on the Nintendo Switch, and this was despite the game releasing later and in 2021 when the number of regular players was diminishing on the Vita. When Fabrice Breton of Cowcat Games, developer of Demetrios and publisher of Xenon Valkyrie Plus, Riddled Corpses X and Demons Tier Plus on Vita, was asked in 2018 if the sales on Vita justified the effort to bring his games to the system, he responded, "Vita is still one of the best-selling platforms for my games, so it was justified." Vita fans were willing to support developers that put in the time and effort to bring games to the system. However, another reason for higher-than-expected sales of Vita games is discoverability. In an interview with Glixel in 2017, Luke Bernard from Arcade Distillery stated that even if you just release an indie game on PS4 or Xbox, you get drowned by other stuff. Consoles like PS4 are home to big-name AAA experiences. 2020 alone has seen the release of Final Fantasy VII Remake, Ghost of Tsushima, and The Last of Us Part 2. And it is not uncommon for the PS4 or Switch to have more than 20 games released in a single week. Getting noticed among so many other releases is difficult for smaller titles, but on Vita, it has been easier for indie games to shine and gain the attention of the system's owners. Evgeny Kopylov, CEO of Sometimes You, publisher of over 24 games for Vita, stated in 2020 that the Vita is still a good market for indie developers, and while sales are not as high as Switch and PS4, the Vita versions of their games, in most cases, still exceed sales on the PC markets, particularly when you factor in physical sales, which continue to be popular with collectors up to the end of the Vita's life. Miguel Sternberg from Spooky Squid, developers of Russian Subway Dogs, one of the final games to be released for Vita, said that his game did about as well as you possibly could, launching a game so late into the Vita's life cycle. Our European launch numbers were actually on par with our launch of They Bleed Pixels on the Nintendo Switch the year before, which was a nice surprise. That said, our American sales were higher than Europe. It's a bigger market, but compared to other launches didn't do quite so well. Given the game launched in 2021, he did not have high expectations for long-term sales. Unfortunately, because we can't run any discounts and Sony keeps adding new hoops to jump through to make purchases on the Vita, I'm not expecting the sort of long tail we have on other platforms. This port will probably never fully pay for itself, but I knew that going in, and I'm just happy it exists now for folks to play. Ease of development. While sales of games are important, developers are also needed to ensure costs were kept under control in order to turn a profit. Fortunately, the Vita was considered easy to develop games for. In 2017, Brian Morrison Elliott from CodeSync, developers of Shoe, stated that no changes to the game's code were needed to bring their game to the Vita. All the gameplay code present in the PS4 release is right there in the Vita release. The only changes were graphical. This was supported by Luke Bernard from Arcade Distillery, developers of Plague Road, who said of developing this title for Vita, "There was no extra time or effort to put in. Our engine runs on Vita. Long story short, it's easy to develop for it." Thomas Altenberger reiterated this viewpoint by stating, "We already ported Neurovoider to the PS4, so it was a matter of a couple of hours to get the game up and running on Vita. He also said that Neurovoider on the handheld has barely any compromise. It runs at 60 FPS. When asked about how it is to develop a game for Vita and whether compromises had to be made, Jared from Rainbite, developers of Reverie, said, "It really isn't too different from developing on any other platform. Since we planned on developing for the Vita from the start, nothing was compromised. None of the game content needed to be changed to make it work on Vita." For their 2021 release, Scourgebringer, Altenberger said, "We made it mostly out of fun. It was almost an accident. We were not expecting to port it to the PS Vita, and it was only after its full release on other platforms that it happened. I was on post-launch vacations and don't know why, but at that point, I thought it would be fun to check if I could get the game running in a couple of hours before giving it up. And it did work, not perfectly, but nice enough to consider actually pushing forward and releasing it." PlayStation support. Although Sony earned itself a negative reputation when it came to promoting and releasing games for the Vita, it seemed that the support they provided developers behind the scenes was another reason for games coming to the system. The decision to release Shu on the Vita came out of Sony approaching CodeSync to bring their game to the PlayStation system. A 2017 article on Glixel confirmed this. In the article, they stated, "While Sony Interactive Entertainment's top executives may talk the device down, many developers we spoke to sang the praises of the people on the front line, doing third-party outreach for Sony. Notably, the strategic content team were particularly effective at encouraging developers and publishers to bring games to the Vita, primarily in the system's early years. And although this support seemed to have reduced as time went by, it is clear that without their efforts, there would have been far fewer games on the device." In an interview with IGN, Wolfgang Wozniak, head of the indie studio Poppyworks, said of Sony that, "With Vita, they did everything right. Even the dev kit is really great. Before this, dev kits were these huge, bulky things, and you needed a physics degree to even operate one. The Vita dev kit is fantastic. It's basically a Vita with extra ports, so it was cheaper for us to develop on Vita, and Sony hired all these people who were always helpful. These people knew their shit. They knew what was cool and they knew how to work with developers." In 2021, a group of indie developers stated that they found PlayStation did not communicate well with developers, and their systems were difficult to work with. Kolpakov disagreed with these comments and stated that Sony, for their part, provide all possible support and, if desired, almost any issue can be resolved. If Sony cannot help for some reason, there is a forum for communication with other developers, and they will be happy to share their experience there. Altenberger stated that he felt Sony's processes were tailored towards bigger publishers, but they were at least supportive to indies. The community. Vita fans are known for being passionate advocates for the device. The supportive community has helped developers get more attention for their games, and they show their appreciation to developers that take the time to release a title on the Vita. Mike Dorr from Infinite State Games, developers of Rogue Aces and Don't Die Mr. Robot, stated, "The Vita fans are by far the most passionate about the system and are also understanding and supporting of developers. They're awesome." Slava Deisling from Behind the Stone, developers of Sir Eats-A-Lot, agreed with this sentiment and added, "We've never seen a community so passionate, friendly and jolly about a platform. It's not dumb fanboyism, but a real celebration of joy for this handheld. This very community was probably the most important reason for us to keep going." So the Vita was easy to develop for, Sony provided support to developers, and sales of Vita games did well compared to their equivalent PS4 release, but one less talked about reason for games coming to the handheld was that publishers and developers were themselves fans of the system. Brian Provinciano of VBlank, developer of Retro City Rampage and Shakedown Hawaii, said, I'm as in love with the PS Vita as I was the day Retro City Rampage launched, and will continue to support it as long as I can. Ratalaika Games continued to bring games to the device well into 2020, despite sales dwindling over time. Founder and owner Adrian Vega stated that one of the reasons for this is because I like playing games on PS Vita myself. This was echoed in a Games Radar article in 2019 where creators from studios such as Drinkbox, Neon Falcom, Aquaria, and Nippon Ichi Software all paid tribute to the device. Russian Subway Dogs was one of the final games to be released on Vita in July 2021. Its developer, Miguel Sternberg, said that, as a big fan of portable gaming, the Vita port is actually now my preferred way to play Subway Dogs. The Vita is just such a great fit for arcade-style games, and the pixel art looks great on that OLED screen. He also praised the support he received from Vita players. The porting process this year has been particularly grueling and solitary, especially with the pandemic, so having folks in the Vita community cheering me on has really helped. Seeing the positive reaction from players after release has also been immensely gratifying. I'm just really happy I was able to finally get the game out in people's hands after such a long development and porting time. Within just a few months of launch, it was clear that the Vita was not going to be the sales success that Sony wanted it to be. But despite this, the system significantly exceeded expectations in terms of its lifespan. The Vita was manufactured for over 7 years and had games being released more than 8 years after its launch, and that was without the help of new first-party releases from PlayStation beyond the first few years. That ultimately could not have happened without the support of the passionate Vita community and the Japanese and indie developers that continued to support the system. Sony have stated multiple times that they would not release a successor to the Vita. For fans of the system, it's hard not to be disappointed with how overlooked and underappreciated the device was. The gaming community and media's reception to it was tinged with negativity even before the Vita had been released. Sony made mistakes, that much is undeniable, ranging from the expensive memory cards to the largely unnecessary back touchpad, but the Vita did succeed in finding a dedicated fanbase that saw the potential in the system and supported it long after it was abandoned by the company that created it. Those that gave it a chance and delved into its library of games discovered a device that is perfect for portable gaming with a superb range of titles, from big-budget console games to smaller indie releases. It was also the perfect device to experience the history of PlayStation, with the ability to play PS1 and PSP games, remasters of classic PS2 titles, follow-ups and spin-offs of key PlayStation franchises, and the ability to remote play PS4 games. Kazuo Hirai, former CEO of Sony, famously said, "Vita means life." While many wrongly wrote it off as dead within weeks of its launch, the Vita proved to be far more resilient than expected, and it will likely be remembered far more favorably in the future compared to how it was treated by players and the games media during its life. Despite their misstep, few can argue that Sony had created something special in the Vita. It was seen as a portable Steam machine for indie games, the best place for localized Japanese visual novels, and a haven for niche RPGs. It led to a wave of limited-run physical games and was a proving ground for new technology such as remote play and online game streaming through PlayStation Now. In some ways, it was ahead of its time. In others, it was doomed by Sony's insistence on repeating past mistakes. It set a new benchmark in terms of console launch lineups and taught the gaming industry the importance of following up a hardware release with a steady stream of titles. It failed to sell the numbers that Sony had hoped for, but it succeeded in inspiring gamers and developers who will no doubt look back on the system with fond memories.